Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a complete journey through one of England's darkest chapters, the terrifying reign of Mary I, known to history as Bloody Mary, a queen who ruthlessly persecuted and executed Protestants, igniting religious violence and earning a notorious place in history. We'll softly explore the entire arc of her life and reign, from her traumatic childhood that shaped a future tyrant, through her bloody ascension to power and the Spanish marriage that sealed England's fate, to the height of her persecution campaign where nearly 300 souls perished in the flames, and finally to her death and the bloody legacy that made her name synonymous with terror throughout history. This comprehensive journey will take us through the making of a monster, her reign of fire, and the eternal warning her story provides about the dangers of extremism and the corruption of absolute power, all while the gentle whispers of Tudor England carry you peacefully toward restful sleep before you drift away into peaceful slumber. Please take a moment to like this video, leave a gentle comment about what you think we can learn from Mary's dark reign, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from the shadows of English history lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Tonight's complete journey will gently guide you through for centuries of perspective on how a beloved princess became history's most feared queen, and how the fires of Smithfield still echo as warnings about the price of religious extremism. Let the darkness of Mary's story remind you of the light of tolerance and compassion as you drift into peaceful dreams. Mary, later known as Queen Mary I of England, entered this world on a cold February morning in 1516 at Greenwich Palace, her first cries echoing through chambers that would one day witness her father's most ruthless decisions. Born to King Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, this infant girl carried within her the seeds of what would become one of England's most terrifying reigns, reign that would see hundreds of her subjects burned alive for their religious beliefs. The baby Mary was welcomed with joy, though tinged with disappointment. Her father, the young and vigorous Henry VIII, desperately needed a male heir to secure the Tudor dynasty that his father had established through blood and conquest at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Yet as Mary lay in her cradle, wrapped in clothed gold and attended by the finest nurses in England, none could foresee that this seemingly innocent child would grow into a woman who would earn the most dreaded nickname in English history. Bloody Mary, her mother, Catherine of Aragon, was herself a daughter of the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, the same rulers who had established the Spanish Inquisition and expelled Jews and Muslims from their kingdom in a wave of religious purification. Perhaps it was this bloodline, this heritage of religious extremism, that would later manifest so terrifyingly in their daughter's approach to ruling. England. Catherine had already endured multiple miscarriages and stillbirths by the time Mary was born. Each lost child had been a devastating blow to Henry's hopes for a male successor, and though he showed affection for his daughter, calling her "my pearl of the world," the shadow of succession anxiety hung over Mary's entire childhood like a dark cloud that would later burst into the storm of her reign. The palace where Mary spent her earliest years was a place of opulence and learning, but also of growing tension. Her mother supervised her education personally, teaching Mary to speak French and Spanish as fluently as English, and ensuring she received instruction in Latin, the language of the Roman Catholic Church that would later become so central to Mary's identity and, ultimately, her persecution of those who rejected it. Even as a small child, Mary showed signs of the intensity that would later characterize her rule. At just 4 years old, she performed for a French delegation on the virginals, a type of harpsichord displaying the kind of focused determination that would later drive her to send hundreds to the flames. Her tutors noted her precocious intelligence and her remarkable memory for religious instruction qualities that would serve her well when she later sought to root out every trace of Protestant heresy from her kingdom. As Mary grew from a cherished infant into a young girl, the atmosphere around her began to darken. Her father's affections had wandered to a young woman at court named Anne Boleyn, whose dark eyes and sharp wit had captured the king's attention in a way that would ultimately reshape England's religious landscape and set the stage for Mary's future reign of terror. Henry's pursuit of Anne Boleyn was not merely a matter of lust. It was intertwined with his desperate need for a male heir and his growing conviction that his marriage to Catherine was cursed by God. He became obsessed with a passage from Leviticus that seemed to condemn marriages between a man and his brother's widow, and he convinced himself that his lack of sons was divine punishment for marrying Catherine, who had briefly been wed to his deceased brother, Arthur. For young Mary, these developments were incomprehensible and terrifying. She watched as her mother, the dignified Catherine of Aragon, was slowly but systematically humiliated and pushed aside. The woman who had taught Mary about duty, faith, and royal dignity was being portrayed as an obstacle to England's future, and by extension, Mary herself was becoming a problem to be solved rather than a daughter to be cherished. The transformation in Mary's circumstances was gradual but relentless. At first, Henry continued to treat her as his heir, even sending her to Wales in 1525 to rule as Princess of Wales, an unprecedented honor for a female heir. At Ludlow Castle, 9-year-old Mary held court with all the ceremony befitting a future monarch, receiving ambassadors and learning the arts of statecraft that would later serve her when she assumed the throne and began her campaign of religious persecution. But even as Mary learned to rule, the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Her father's great matter, his quest for a divorce from Catherine, was consuming the royal court and drawing England into a conflict with Rome that would have devastating consequences for the realm's religious future. Henry's advisors, led by the brilliant but ruthless Thomas Cromwell, were laying the groundwork for England's break with the Catholic Church, a break that would ultimately drive Mary to the extreme measures that would earn her the name Bloody. Mary, the young princess, began to experience strange physical symptoms during this period: irregular menstruation, bouts of depression, and mysterious illnesses that may have been early manifestations of the reproductive problems that would later contribute to her increasing paranoia and cruelty. Some historians suggest these ailments were psychosomatic, the result of the intense stress she was experiencing as her world crumbled around her. Catherine of Aragon, meanwhile, remained defiant in the face of Henry's pressure. She refused to acknowledge that her marriage was invalid, insisted that she was England's true queen, and fought every legal challenge with the determination of a woman who knew that her daughter's future depended on her own steadfastness. This resistance would later serve as a model for Mary's own stubborn refusal to compromise when she became queen and faced opposition to her religious policies. In 1533, when Mary was 17, her world finally collapsed completely. Henry VIII secretly married Anne Boleyn in January of that year, and by May, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer had declared the king's first marriage null and void. In September, Anne gave birth to a daughter. The future Elizabeth I, and Mary found herself not only stripped of her title as princess, but forced to serve in the household of the infant who had replaced her in the succession. The psychological impact of these events on Mary cannot be overstated. She had gone from being the heir to England's throne to being declared illegitimate, from being her father's pearl of the world to being an unwanted reminder of his discarded first marriage. The humiliation was deliberate and systematic. designed to break her spirit and force her to acknowledge the legitimacy of her father's new marriage and new religious settlement. Anne Boleyn, now Queen Anne, seemed to take particular pleasure in Mary's downfall. Reports from court suggest that Anne had deliberately made Mary's life as difficult as possible, perhaps seeing the former princess as a permanent threat to her own daughter's inheritance. Mary was forced to walk behind Elizabeth's cradle at public ceremonies, to curtsy to a baby sister she had been taught to see as illegitimate, and to endure constant reminders that she was now nothing more than the Lady Mary, a bastard daughter. With no claim to the throne, these years of humiliation would have a profound impact on Mary's later treatment of those she considered heretics and traitors. The seeds of the cruelty that would characterize her reign were planted during this period, as she learned firsthand what it meant to be cast aside for political and religious reasons. The woman who would later show no mercy to Protestant reformers was herself formed by years of merciless treatment at the hands of those who had overturned her world. Henry's break with Rome during this period was primarily motivated by his desire for the divorce, but it opened the floodgates for Protestant reformers who had long sought to change England's religious practices. Thomas Cranmer, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, began introducing reforms that horrified Mary and her supporters. The Mass was altered, monasteries were dissolved, and traditional Catholic practices were slowly but steadily eliminated. For Mary, these changes were not merely political, they were spiritual attacks on everything she held sacred. She had been raised to see herself as a Catholic princess, destined to rule a Catholic England, and she watched with growing anger as Protestant reformers dismantled the religious framework that had shaped her identity. Every change, every reform, every move away from traditional Catholicism was stored in her memory, building a catalogue of grievances that would later be paid for in blood when she finally had the power to exact revenge. The period also saw Mary's relationship with her father deteriorate to the point where they did not speak for 3 years. Henry, under pressure from Anne Boleyn and his Protestant advisors, demanded that Mary acknowledge his supremacy over the English Church, repudiate the Pope's authority, and admit that her parents' marriage had been unlawful. Mary's refusal to do so was seen as treasonous, and there were whispers at court that the king might have his daughter executed for her defiance. In 1536, Mary's fortunes suddenly changed when Anne Boleyn fell from grace as dramatically as she had risen. Accused of adultery, treason, and even witchcraft, Anne was arrested, tried, and executed in a matter of weeks. The woman who had tormented Mary for years was gone, her head severed by a French swordsman's blade on a scaffold within the Tower of London. Mary watched these events with what can only be described as grim satisfaction. The woman who had destroyed her mother's life and stolen her own inheritance had paid the ultimate price, and Mary saw in Anne's fate a divine judgment that reinforced her belief in the righteousness of her own cause. This experience would later influence her conviction that heretics and traitors deserved the most severe punishments available under law. With Anne's death, Elizabeth was also declared illegitimate, making the two sisters equals in their legal status as bastard daughters of the king. This change in circumstances allowed Mary to begin rebuilding her relationship with her father, though the reconciliation came at a terrible personal cost. Henry demanded that Mary signed a document acknowledging his supremacy over the English Church and admitting that her parents' marriage had been unlawful, essentially requiring her to repudiate everything her mother had fought for. Mary initially resisted, but pressure from her cousin, Emperor Charles V, and the very real threat of execution finally forced her to submit. She signed a document that branded her own birth as illegitimate and acknowledged her father as the supreme head of the Church of England, a compromise that would haunt her for the rest of her life and contribute to the extreme measures she would later take to prove her Catholic orthodoxy. The signing of this document was a traumatic experience that left deep psychological scars. Mary had been forced to betray her own mother's memory and her deepest religious convictions in order to save her life, and the shame and guilt she felt would manifest years later in her desperate need to prove her Catholic loyalty through the persecution of Protestants. The woman who would burn hundreds of heretics was herself someone who had been forced to commit what she saw as heresy against her own beliefs. Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, played a crucial role in Mary's rehabilitation. At court, Jane actively encouraged Henry to restore his daughters to favor, and under her influence, Mary found herself welcomed back into the royal family. When Jane gave birth to Prince Edward in 1537, finally providing Henry with the male heir he had sought for so long, Mary served as the baby's godmother, a sign that she had been fully restored to her father's affections. But Jane's death from childbirth, complications just days after Edward's birth, was another traumatic experience for Mary. She had come to see Jane as the closest thing to a mother figure she had known since Catherine's banishment. And Jane's sudden death reinforced Mary's growing belief that England was cursed by God for abandoning the true faith. This conviction would later drive her to take increasingly extreme measures to restore Catholicism and lift what she saw as divine punishment from the realm. The years following Jane Seymour's death saw Henry marry 3 more times, but none of these marriages brought Mary the stability and affection she craved. Her relationship with her 4th stepmother, Anne of Cleves, was cordial but distant, while her 5th stepmother, Catherine Howard, was closer to Mary's age than to Henry's, and seemed to resent Mary's presence at court. It was during this period that Mary began to develop the rigid religious worldview that would later characterize her reign. Surrounded by Protestant reformers who continued to dismantle England's Catholic traditions, Mary clung ever more tightly to her faith as the one constant in her turbulent life. She attended Mass daily, spent hours in prayer, and began to see herself as a guardian of the true faith in an increasingly heretical kingdom. The execution of Catherine Howard in 1542 for adultery was another reminder to Mary of the dangers that surrounded royal women who fell from favor. She watched as her young stepmother was dragged to the scaffold, and the sight reinforced her growing conviction that weakness and compromise led only to destruction. The woman who would later show no mercy to condemned heretics was learning that mercy itself could be seen as weakness in the brutal world of Tudor politics. Henry's 6th and final wife, Catherine Parr, brought some stability to Mary's life, but she also represented everything Mary had come to fear about England's religious future. Catherine was a learned woman with Protestant sympathies who encouraged theological discussion and reform, and her influence over Henry in his final years helped accelerate England's drift away from Catholicism. Mary found herself increasingly isolated at court during these years, surrounded by people who saw her religious convictions as outdated and dangerous. The young woman who had once been heir to England's throne was now viewed as a relic of the past, someone whose rigid Catholicism made her unsuitable for rule in an increasingly Protestant kingdom. This isolation would later contribute to her inability to understand the depth of opposition her religious policies would generate when she finally became queen. The execution of her former governess, Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, in 1541 was particularly traumatic for Mary. The elderly countess, who had cared for Mary during her childhood, was brutally hacked to death by an inexperienced executioner in what was widely seen as one of Henry's most barbarous acts. Mary witnessed how even the most innocent and loyal could be destroyed by the religious and political upheavals of the time. And the lesson was not lost on her. When Henry VIII died in 1547, Mary found herself facing an even more dire situation. Her 9-year-old half-brother, Edward VI, was now king. But real power lay in the hands of Protestant reformers who were determined to complete England's transformation into a thoroughly Protestant nation. The Regency Council, dominated by figures like Edward Seymour and John Dudley, saw Mary's Catholicism as a direct threat to their religious revolution. The boy king himself, despite his youth, had been thoroughly indoctrinated with Protestant theology and seemed to view his elder sister's religious beliefs with a mixture of pity and contempt. Edward's tutors had taught him to see the Pope as the Antichrist and Catholicism as a false religion that had to be eliminated from England, and he embraced these teachings with the fervor of youth. For Mary, Edward's reign represented everything she had feared about England's religious future made manifest. The Latin Mass was abolished and replaced with English services. Catholic imagery was stripped from churches, and priests were allowed to marry. All changes that struck at the heart of Mary's understanding of proper Christian worship. She watched in horror as everything her mother had fought to preserve was systematically destroyed by her own half-brother's government. Mary's response was characteristically stubborn and uncompromising. She continued to hear Mass in the traditional Latin form in her private chapel, openly defying the new religious laws and setting herself up as a focal point for Catholic resistance. When Edward's government demanded that she conform to the new religious settlement, she replied that she would obey God rather than man, a position that put her in direct conflict with the crown. The confrontation between Mary and Edward's government escalated throughout the early 1550s. When Mary was summoned to court for Christmas 1550, she arrived with a large retinue, all of whom openly carried rosary beads in defiance of the new religious laws. The scene that followed was deeply embarrassing for both siblings. The 13-year-old king publicly denouncing his 34-year-old sister for her disobedience, while Mary stood firm in her refusal to abandon her faith. This public humiliation was a turning point for Mary. She realized that Edward's Protestant advisors would never allow her to practice her religion freely, and she began to contemplate more drastic measures. The woman who would later show no mercy to Protestant heretics was learning that compromise with heretics was impossible, a lesson that would inform her approach to religious dissent when she finally had the power to suppress it. By the early 1550s, Mary had developed a worldview that would guide her actions as queen. She saw herself as a faithful Catholic surrounded by heretics, a true believer in a kingdom that had abandoned God, and a potential restorer of England's religious orthodoxy. The years of humiliation, persecution, and resistance had forged her into someone who viewed religious conflict in absolute terms. There could be no compromise with error, no mercy for those who led others into heresy. Mary's health continued to deteriorate during this period, with symptoms that modern historians believe may have indicated endometrial or ovarian problems. These physical ailments, combined with the psychological stress of her situation, contributed to her increasingly rigid and uncompromising personality. The woman who would later order the burning of pregnant women and elderly bishops was someone whose own suffering had taught her to see pain as a necessary part of serving God. The influence of her cousin, Emperor Charles V, also played a crucial role in shaping Mary's future approach to heresy. Charles was the most powerful Catholic ruler in Europe and a strong supporter of the Inquisition in Spain and the Netherlands. Through correspondence and diplomatic contacts, Mary was kept informed of the methods being used to suppress heresy in other Catholic territories, and she began to see these brutal tactics as both necessary and godly. Mary's correspondence from this period reveals a woman who was becoming increasingly convinced that England's religious problems required extreme solutions. She wrote of her desire to restore the realm to its ancient faith, and expressed admiration for the way Catholic rulers in other countries had dealt with heretical subjects. The seeds of the Marian persecution were being planted in these years of opposition and resistance. The young woman who had once been known for her musical talents and linguistic abilities was transforming into someone whose primary identity was that of a Catholic martyr in waiting. Mary began to see herself as chosen by God to restore England to the true faith, regardless of the cost in human life. This sense of divine mission would later justify, in her own mind, the burning of hundreds of Protestant reformers who stood in the way of her religious restoration. As Edward VI's health began to fail in the early 1550s, Mary prepared herself for the possibility that she might one day rule England. The plans she was making during this period reveal a woman who had learned hard lessons about the necessity of ruthless action in religious matters. The future Bloody Mary was emerging from the trials of her youth, shaped by trauma and hardened by years of resistance, into someone who would stop at nothing to achieve her goals. When it became clear that Edward VI was dying in the summer of 1553, Mary found herself facing the greatest crisis of her life. Edward's Protestant advisors, led by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, were determined to prevent a Catholic restoration and hatched a desperate plot to alter the succession. Instead of allowing Mary to inherit the throne, as Henry VIII's will had decreed, they planned to place Lady Jane Grey, a Protestant great-niece of Henry VIII, on the throne. The conspiracy against Mary was not merely political, it was an attempt to prevent what Northumberland and his allies saw as a religious catastrophe. They knew that Mary's accession would mean the restoration of Catholicism and the persecution of Protestant reformers, and they were willing to commit treason to prevent it. Their fears, as events would prove, were entirely justified. Mary learned of the plot through loyal supporters who warned her not to travel to London when Edward summoned her to court. Instead of walking into Northumberland's trap, she fled to her estates in East Anglia, where she began gathering support for her claim to the throne. The woman who would later prove so ruthless in suppressing opposition showed remarkable courage and determination in defending her own rights during this crisis. The brief reign of Lady Jane Grey, 9 days Queen, was a crucial turning point in Mary's development as a ruler. Jane's supporters portrayed Mary as a dangerous Catholic who would drag England back into the darkness of papal superstition, while Mary's supporters saw Jane as a usurper who had stolen the throne from its rightful heir. The religious dimension of this conflict was impossible to ignore. Mary's triumph in deposing Jane Grey after just 9 days was seen by her supporters as a sign of divine favor. The speed with which the country rallied to Mary's cause convinced her that God was on her side and that the English people were eager to return to the Catholic faith. This misreading of public opinion would have tragic consequences when Mary began implementing her religious policies. The execution of Jane Grey and her husband, Guildford Dudley, in 1554 marked the beginning of Mary's reign of terror, though it was justified at the time as necessary punishment for treason. Mary initially showed mercy to the young woman who had been a pawn in Northumberland's scheme, but Jane's involvement in Wyatt's rebellion convinced Mary that mercy toward traitors was a luxury she could not afford. The pattern of initial clemency, followed by ruthless punishment, would characterize Mary's entire reign. On October 1st, 1553, Mary was crowned Queen of England in Westminster Abbey by Bishop Stephen Gardiner, a ceremony that marked not just the accession of a new monarch, but the beginning of what would become one of the most terrifying reigns in English history. As the crown was placed on her head, Mary believed she was being invested with a divine mission to restore England to the Catholic faith, regardless of the cost. The new queen's first actions gave little hint of the bloodbath that was to come. Mary initially proclaimed that she would not compel her subjects to follow her religion, a statement that was welcomed by moderates who hoped for a peaceful transition. But even as she made these conciliatory gestures, Mary was planning the complete restoration of Catholicism and the elimination of Protestant influence from English religious life. Mary's early popularity was genuine but fragile. Many English people were happy to see Henry VIII's eldest daughter on the throne, and there was widespread sympathy for the way she had been treated during her father's reign. But this goodwill would quickly evaporate as Mary's true intentions became clear and the fires of Smithfield began to burn. The Queen's choice of advisors revealed her true priorities. She recalled Catholic bishops who had been imprisoned during Edward's reign, restored Catholic ceremonies to the royal court, and began surrounding herself with advisors who shared her vision of a thoroughly Catholic England. The stage was being set for the persecution that would earn Mary her bloody nickname. As Mary settled into her role as queen, she was already planning the campaign of religious terror that would define her reign. The woman who had spent years as a victim of religious persecution was about to become its most ruthless perpetrator, and the transformation from persecuted princess to persecuting queen was nearly complete. The making of the monster was finished. Bloody Mary was ready to begin her reign of terror, and England was about to learn the true cost of religious extremism. The fires were about to be lit, and hundreds of innocent people were about to pay the price for Mary's traumatic journey from beloved princess to feared tyrant. In the quiet chambers of Greenwich Palace, where she had been born 37 years earlier, Mary Tudor had completed her transformation into the woman history would remember as Bloody Mary. The stage was set for one of the most terrifying chapters in English history, and the Queen who would burn her people was ready to begin her work. Sleep now, dear listener, as we prepare for the horrors that are to come in part 2 of our journey through Bloody Mary's reign of terror. Close your eyes and drift away, but remember sometimes the most peaceful moments come just before the storm. And Mary's storm was about to break upon England with devastating force. Mary, later known as Queen Mary I of England, had secured her throne, but her greatest challenges lay ahead. At 37 years old, the newly crowned queen faced the pressing need to secure the Catholic succession and produce an heir who would continue her religious restoration. Her choice of husband would determine not only England's political future, but also the fate of thousands of her subjects, who would soon feel the flames of her religious persecution. The marriage negotiations that would seal England's destiny began. Almost immediately after Mary's coronation, Emperor Charles V, Mary's cousin and the most powerful Catholic ruler in Europe, saw an opportunity to extend Spanish influence into England through a marriage alliance. He proposed his son, Prince Philip of Spain, as a husband for the English queen, match that would have catastrophic consequences for religious freedom in England. Philip II of Spain was 11 years younger than Mary, a widower with a young son and heir to the vast Spanish Empire that stretched across Europe and the Americas. More importantly for Mary's future persecution of Protestants, Philip was a fervent Catholic who had learned the brutal methods of the Spanish Inquisition from his father. The man who would become Mary's husband and partner in religious terror had grown up in a kingdom where heresy was punishable by death and where the Church's authority was enforced through systematic torture and execution. When a portrait of Philip, painted by the master artist Titian, arrived at the English court in late 1553, Mary reportedly fell in love at first sight. The painting showed a handsome young man in rich Spanish dress, with the bearing of someone born to rule vast territories. What the portrait could not show was the cold calculation behind Philip's eyes, or his willingness to use extreme violence to suppress religious dissent, qualities that would make him the perfect partner for Mary's future campaign of terror. The English reaction to the proposed Spanish marriage was immediate and hostile. Parliament sent a delegation to Mary begging her to choose an English husband, fearing that a foreign prince would drag England into Spain's wars and reduce the kingdom to a mere province of the Spanish Empire. These fears would prove remarkably prescient, as Philip's influence would indeed push Mary toward increasingly extreme measures in her persecution of Protestant heretics. Mary's response to parliamentary opposition revealed the stubborn determination that would later characterize her approach to religious dissent. She declared that her marriage was her own affair and refused to consider any alternative suitors. The woman who would soon claim absolute authority over her subjects' religious beliefs was asserting absolute authority over her own personal choices, regardless of the consequences for England. The announcement of Mary's intention to marry Philip of Spain triggered the first major crisis of her reign, Wyatt's Rebellion, an uprising that would give Mary her first taste of the blood that would later flow so freely during her persecution of Protestant heretics. Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger, leading a force of Kentish rebels, marched on London in early 1554 with the declared intention of deposing Mary and placing her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth on the throne. The rebellion was motivated by a combination of anti-Spanish sentiment and Protestant fear of what Mary's marriage would mean for England's religious future. The rebels correctly understood that a Catholic queen married to a Spanish prince would inevitably lead to the restoration of papal authority and the persecution of Protestant reformers. Their attempt to prevent this outcome would cost many of them their lives and give Mary her first opportunity to demonstrate the ruthlessness that would characterize her reign. Mary's response to the rebellion was swift and merciless. Rather than attempting to negotiate or compromise, she immediately branded the rebels as traitors deserving of death. When Wyatt's forces reached the outskirts of London, Mary delivered a rousing speech at the Guildhall that demonstrated both her courage and her growing taste for absolute authority. She declared that she would rather die than abandon her chosen husband, and she called upon loyal Londoners to defend their anointed queen against treasonous rebels. The defeat and capture of Wyatt marked a turning point in Mary's approach to dealing with opposition. The queen, who had initially promised religious tolerance, was learning that mercy toward enemies was interpreted as weakness. The brutal suppression of Wyatt's rebellion would serve as a template for her later treatment of religious dissents, with merciless and designed to terrorize potential opponents into submission. The executions that followed Wyatt's defeat were carried out with a systematic cruelty that foreshadowed the Marian persecution. Wyatt himself was hanged, drawn, and quartered, the traditional punishment for traitors, and his dismembered body was displayed as a warning to others. Nearly 100 of his followers were also executed, their heads mounted on spikes around London as a grim reminder of the cost of opposing Queen Mary. Perhaps most significantly, the rebellion provided Mary with a justification for executing Lady Jane Grey and her husband Guildford Dudley. Although Jane had played no role in Wyatt's plot, Mary decided that as long as the former queen lived, she would remain a focal point for Protestant opposition. The execution of the 16-year-old Jane Grey in February 1554 demonstrated Mary's willingness to kill even innocent young women if she perceived them as threats to her authority, a willingness that would soon extend to Protestant reformers of all ages and backgrounds. Despite the opposition and bloodshed, Mary remained determined to marry Philip of Spain. The wedding took place at Winchester Cathedral on July 25, 1554, just 2 days after the couple met for the first time. The ceremony was deliberately held at Winchester because it was associated with King Arthur and English royal tradition. But the reality was that Mary was binding England to a foreign power that would push her toward increasingly extreme religious policies. Philip's arrival in England marked the beginning of a new phase in Mary's reign, one in which Spanish influence would accelerate the persecution of Protestant heretics. Philip brought with him a retinue of Spanish priests and advisors who were experienced in the methods of the Inquisition and who would help Mary implement similar techniques in England. The Spanish connection would prove crucial in Mary's development into the monster known as Bloody Mary. The marriage ceremony itself was a mixture of English and Spanish traditions, symbolizing the fusion of the two kingdoms' approaches to religious authority. Mary wore a gown of rich purple and gold, while Philip was dressed in Spanish court attire. The wedding ring was deliberately simpler plain gold band that Mary would wear until her death, but the marriage itself would prove to be anything but simple in its consequences for England's religious minorities. From the beginning, the marriage was more political than romantic. Philip had no genuine affection for his older bride, seeing the union primarily as a means of extending Spanish influence and securing England as an ally in the broader Catholic campaign against Protestant Europe. His Spanish advisors made no secret of their contempt for English customs and their belief that England needed to be purged of heretical influences through systematic persecution. Mary, however, was genuinely infatuated with her young Spanish husband. She saw in Philip not only a means of securing the Catholic succession, but also the strong male authority figure she had lacked since her father's death. Philip's influence over Mary would prove decisive in her decision to implement the burning of heretics as official policy. His experience with the Spanish Inquisition provided the model for what would become the Marian persecution. The wedding was followed by celebrations that deliberately emphasized Catholic ritual and Spanish grandeur. The English court was transformed into something resembling a Spanish royal household, with elaborate Catholic ceremonies, Spanish courtiers, and a new emphasis on the kind of religious orthodoxy that left no room for Protestant dissent. The stage was being set for the terror that was to come. In September 1554, just 2 months after her wedding, Mary announced that she was pregnant. The news was greeted with joy by Catholics, who saw it as a sign of divine favor, and with dread by Protestants who understood that a Catholic heir would ensure the permanent restoration of papal authority in England. What none could have predicted was how the failure of this pregnancy would contribute to Mary's descent into the religious extremism that would define her reign. Mary exhibited all the classic signs of pregnancy: morning sickness, weight gain, and a swelling abdomen. Court physicians confirmed the pregnancy, and Parliament passed legislation naming Philip as regent in the event that Mary died in childbirth. The Queen herself was convinced that God was blessing her marriage and her religious policies with the gift of an heir who would continue the work of Catholic restoration. As the months passed, Mary's conviction that she was carrying England's Catholic future became increasingly central to her identity as Queen. She commissioned special masses celebrating the expected birth of a prince, and she began making plans for the religious education of the child who would inherit both the English crown and the Spanish Empire. The phantom pregnancy became intertwined with Mary's sense of divine mission in ways that would have tragic consequences when the truth became apparent. The expected birth date came and went in the spring of 1555, but no child was born. As weeks turned to months, Mary's abdomen began to recede, and the terrible truth became apparent: there had been no pregnancy at all. Modern historians believe Mary suffered from a phantom pregnancy, a rare condition caused by a combination of hormonal imbalances and intense psychological desire for a child. The devastation of this revelation would push Mary toward the extreme religious persecution that would earn her the name Bloody Mary. The failure of the pregnancy was seen by Mary as a sign of God's displeasure with England's incomplete return to Catholicism. She became convinced that her inability to produce an heir was divine punishment for tolerating Protestant heresy in her kingdom, and she resolved to accelerate the process of religious purification through increasingly violent means. The woman who had shown initial restraint in religious matters was about to become the most feared persecutor of heretics in English history. Philip's reaction to the failed pregnancy was cold and calculating. He had married Mary primarily to secure Spanish influence in England, and her inability to produce an heir made the marriage strategically worthless to him. His growing distance from Mary, combined with her desperate need to prove her worthiness in God's eyes, created the perfect conditions for the religious terror that was about to begin. In November 1554, during the height of Mary's phantom pregnancy, Cardinal Reginald Pole arrived in England as papal legate. Pole's return marked a crucial turning point in Mary's reign, as he brought with him not only the Pope's authority to absolve England of its heretical past, but also the theological justification for the systematic persecution of Protestant reformers that would soon begin. Cardinal Pole was a complex figure whose own family had been destroyed by Henry VIII's religious policies. His mother, Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, had been brutally executed on Henry's orders, and Reginald himself had spent years in exile, writing denunciations of the English Reformation and calling for foreign intervention to restore Catholicism. His return to England was motivated by a combination of genuine religious conviction and a burning desire for revenge against those who had supported the Protestant reforms. Pole's arrival at court was stage-managed for maximum symbolic impact. Mary received him at Whitehall Palace in a ceremony that deliberately recalled the Annunciation, with Pole greeting the Queen using the angel Gabriel's words to the Virgin Mary. The message was clear: Mary's reign was divinely ordained, and her mission to restore Catholicism had heavenly approval. This sense of divine mission would justify, in Mary's mind, any measures necessary to eliminate Protestant heresy. The Cardinal brought with him extensive knowledge of how other Catholic territories had dealt with heretical movements. He had studied the methods of the Spanish Inquisition, the suppression of Protestant movements in the Netherlands, and the brutal campaigns against heretics in France and Italy. This expertise would prove invaluable when Mary began implementing her own persecution of English Protestants. Pole's influence on Mary was immediate and profound. Where she had initially shown some restraint in religious matters, Pole encouraged her to see any tolerance of Protestant ideas as betrayal of her Catholic duty. He helped her understand that true restoration of Catholicism required not just the return of Catholic practices, but the complete elimination of Protestant influence through systematic persecution. The theological framework for what would become the Marian persecution was taking shape. The first executions of Protestant reformers under Mary's reign began in February 1555, marking the start of what would become one of the most systematic campaigns of religious persecution in English history. The burning of heretics was not a spontaneous outbreak of violence, but a carefully planned policy designed to terrorize the Protestant community into submission and demonstrate Mary's absolute commitment to Catholic orthodoxy. The first victim was John Rogers, a married priest and Bible translator who had played a prominent role in the English Reformation under Edward VI. Rogers was arrested in August 1554 and spent months in prison before being brought to trial for heresy. His case would establish the pattern for all subsequent persecutions, show trial in which the accused was given the opportunity to recant their Protestant beliefs, followed by execution if they refused to submit to Catholic authority. Rogers' trial revealed the theological framework that would justify hundreds of subsequent executions. He was accused not merely of holding incorrect religious opinions, but of leading others into damnation through his preaching and writing. Mary's government argued that heretics were not just mistaken individuals, but dangerous criminals who threatened the spiritual welfare of the entire kingdom. This logic would be used to justify the burning of men, women, and even children who refused to abandon their Protestant faith. The execution of John Rogers on February 4, 1555, took place at Smithfield, a site just outside London that would become synonymous with the Marian persecution. Rogers was tied to a stake and surrounded with bundles of wood and straw, then burned alive as crowds watched. Contemporary accounts describe his courage in the face of death, but they also reveal the systematic nature of the persecution that was beginning. This was not mob violence, but state-sponsored terrorism designed to eliminate Protestant influence through fear. 3 days after Rogers' execution, Lawrence Saunders, another married priest, was burned at Coventry. The choice of location was deliberate. Government wanted to ensure that the persecution was not confined to London, but would be visible throughout the kingdom. The burning of heretics was intended as public theatre, designed to demonstrate the consequences of defying Catholic authority and to terrorize potential dissidents into submission. On February 9, 1555, 2 more Protestant reformers were burned. On the same day, Rowland Taylor, Ad Hadler, and John Hooper, the former Bishop of Gloucester, at Gloucester itself. Hooper's execution was particularly horrific, as the wood was too green to burn properly, and he suffered in agony for nearly an hour before finally dying. The deliberate cruelty of these executions revealed the sadistic element that would characterize the entire Marian persecution. The systematic nature of the Marian persecution required an extensive bureaucratic apparatus to identify, try, and execute heretics. Mary's government established ecclesiastical courts with the power to investigate suspected Protestants, and these courts were staffed with Catholic clergy who had experienced the Protestant reforms as personal persecution and were eager for revenge. Bishop Edmund Bonner of London became the most notorious of Mary's persecutors, earning the nickname Bloody Bonner for his enthusiasm in hunting down and condemning Protestant reformers. Bonner's court in London became a factory for producing heresy convictions, processing dozens of cases each month and sending a steady stream of victims to the fires of Smithfield. His methods included torture, psychological pressure, and elaborate show trials designed to humiliate the accused before their execution. The legal process used in heresy trials was deliberately designed to ensure conviction. Accused heretics were not allowed legal representation, and the burden of proof was reversed. They had to prove their orthodoxy, rather than having their heresy proven against them. The trials were conducted in Latin, which most of the accused could not understand, and the theological questions they were asked were designed to trap them into admitting heretical beliefs. Mary herself took a personal interest in the persecution, reviewing cases and often ordering that mercy be denied, even to those who attempted to recant. She saw each execution as a blow struck for the true faith and a step toward England's complete purification from Protestant heresy. The Queen, who had once been a victim of religious persecution, had become its most enthusiastic perpetrator. The geographical spread of the persecution was carefully planned to ensure maximum impact. While Smithfield in London remained the primary execution site, burnings also took place in Canterbury, Oxford, Gloucester, Coventry, and dozens of other towns and cities. No part of England was to be free from the terror that Mary hoped would drive Protestant ideas from the kingdom forever. Perhaps no single case better illustrates the personal vindictiveness that drove Mary's persecution than her treatment of Thomas Cranmer, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, who had been instrumental in her father's divorce from Catherine of Aragon and in the Protestant reforms of Edward VI's reign. Cranmer's trial and execution would demonstrate both the systematic cruelty of the Marian persecution and Mary's determination to exact personal revenge on those who had wronged her family. Cranmer had been arrested immediately after Mary's accession and had spent over 2 years in prison before being brought to trial. During his imprisonment, he had been subjected to psychological pressure designed to break his spirit and force him to recant his Protestant beliefs. The old archbishop, now in his 60s, had been forced to watch as his former colleagues, Latimer and Ridley, were burned at Oxford in October 1555, a deliberate attempt to terrorize him into submission. The trial of Cranmer was conducted with elaborate ceremony designed to demonstrate the triumph of Catholicism over Protestant reform. He was accused not only of heresy but of participating in the unlawful divorce of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, charges that struck directly at Mary's deepest personal grievances. The woman who had never forgiven those responsible for her mother's humiliation was finally able to exact her revenge. Under enormous pressure and facing certain death, Cranmer eventually broke and signed a series of recantations, renouncing his Protestant beliefs and acknowledging papal authority. According to the normal procedures of heresy trials, this should have saved his life, but Mary was determined that Cranmer would burn regardless of any recantation. Her decision to execute him anyway revealed the vindictive personal element that lay beneath the theological justification for the persecution. Cranmer's final moments provided one of the most dramatic scenes of the entire Marian persecution. Brought to St. Mary's Church in Oxford on March 21st, 1556, to make a public recantation before his execution, the old Archbishop instead used the opportunity to renounce his earlier submission and reaffirm his Protestant faith. In a powerful speech that electrified the crowd, he declared that the Pope was Christ's enemy and Antichrist, and that his hand that had signed the recantation deserved to burn first. When Cranmer was dragged to the stake and the fire was lit, he fulfilled his promise by thrusting his right hand into the flames, crying out, "This hand hath offended." His courage in death transformed him from a broken old man into a Protestant martyr, and his execution backfired spectacularly for Mary's government. Instead of demonstrating the triumph of Catholicism, Cranmer's death inspired Protestant resistance and provided powerful propaganda for Mary's opponents. By the end of 1555, the Marian persecution had developed into a systematic campaign of terror that was claiming victims at an unprecedented rate. The initial focus on prominent Protestant leaders had expanded to include ordinary people weavers, farmers, merchants, and housewives who had embraced Protestant ideas during the reforms of Edward VI's reign. Mary's government was determined to root out heresy at every level of society, regardless of the age, gender, or social status of the accused. The expansion of the persecution to include women and children revealed the truly radical nature of Mary's religious policies. Previous English rulers had generally shown reluctance to execute women for religious offenses, but Mary's persecution made no such distinctions. Protestant women were burned alongside men, and their executions were often particularly cruel because of contemporary beliefs about women's supposed greater susceptibility to heretical ideas. The case of pregnant women presented particular challenges for Mary's persecutors, but they developed increasingly extreme solutions that revealed the depths of their fanaticism. In several instances, pregnant Protestant women were kept in prison until they gave birth, then executed immediately afterward. In at least one case, a woman was burned while pregnant, with her child allegedly falling from her body into the flames, image that would haunt Catholic consciences for generations. Children, as young as 16, were also caught up in the persecution, as Mary's government argued that youth was no excuse for heresy and that young heretics were actually more dangerous because they had longer to spread their false beliefs. The execution of young Protestant apprentices and servants demonstrated that Mary's campaign was intended to eliminate an entire generation of Protestant believers. The scale and brutality of the Marian persecution quickly attracted international attention, much of it negative, even from Catholic powers, who found Mary's methods excessive. While Philip II of Spain supported his wife's religious policies in principle, some of his own advisors warned that the persecution was generating more opposition than support for Catholicism and was damaging England's reputation throughout Europe. French Catholic observers noted with concern that Mary's methods were more extreme than those used in France's own campaigns against Protestant Huguenots. Italian diplomats reported to their governments that the English persecution was generating sympathy for Protestant martyrs, even among some Catholics who were horrified by the systematic cruelty being employed. The international Catholic community was beginning to worry that Mary's extremism might actually harm the broader Catholic cause. Protestant powers, meanwhile, used the Marian persecution as powerful propaganda against Catholic rule. German Protestant princes circulated accounts of English martyrs to demonstrate the dangers of Catholic restoration, while Protestant refugees from England spread horror stories throughout Protestant Europe. The persecution that Mary hoped would demonstrate Catholic strength was actually undermining Catholic credibility. Spanish influence on the persecution was both direct and indirect. Philip's Spanish advisors provided theological justification for the burnings and helped establish the bureaucratic machinery necessary for systematic persecution. More importantly, the Spanish model of using extreme violence to maintain religious orthodoxy provided the template for Mary's policies. The English persecution was essentially an attempt to implement Spanish Inquisition methods in a different national context. The Marian persecution imposed enormous costs on the English economy and administration. The elaborate trials, the maintenance of prisoners awaiting execution, and the public ceremonies surrounding the burnings required significant resources at a time when England was already struggling financially. The persecution was not only morally costly, but economically ruinous for a kingdom that could ill afford such expenditures. The impact on local communities was particularly severe. Towns and villages were forced to provide wood, labor, and facilities for executions, and local officials were required to participate in the persecution whether they supported it or not. The systematic nature of the campaign meant that no community could remain uninvolved in the machinery of terror that Mary had created. Perhaps most seriously, the persecution was driving away skilled craftsmen, merchants, and professionals whose Protestant beliefs made them targets for Mary's campaign. The Protestant exile communities that formed in Protestant German cities and Swiss cantons included many of England's most talented and productive citizens. Their departure weakened England economically and strengthened Protestant powers that welcomed their skills and knowledge. By late 1555, the systematic nature of the Marian persecution was beginning to generate organized resistance. Underground Protestant networks were forming to help potential victims escape the country, and a steady stream of Protestant literature was being smuggled in from exile communities abroad. The persecution that was intended to eliminate Protestant influence was actually strengthening Protestant resolve and organization. The heroic deaths of Protestant martyrs were providing powerful propaganda for the Protestant cause. Detailed accounts of executions were being secretly circulated, emphasizing the courage and faith of the victims and contrasting their godly behavior with the cruelty of their persecutors. These martyr accounts would later be compiled by John Foxe into his Acts and Monuments, better known as Foxe's Book of Martyrs, which would ensure that the Marian persecution would be remembered as one of the most shameful episodes in English history. Mary's government was aware of the growing resistance but seemed incapable of adapting its tactics. Instead of moderating the persecution in response to criticism, Mary doubled down on her policies, convinced that any show of weakness would be interpreted as abandonment of the Catholic cause. The Queen, who had learned to see compromise as betrayal, was incapable of recognizing that her extreme methods were undermining her own objectives. In August 1555, Just as the persecution was reaching its peak intensity, Philip II departed England to attend to his continental territories, leaving Mary alone to deal with the growing opposition to her policies. Philip's absence devastated Mary emotionally and removed the one person whose opinion she valued above all others. Without her husband's support and guidance, Mary's persecution became even more erratic and extreme. The Queen's emotional state during this period was precarious. The failure of her pregnancy, the growing resistance to her religious policies, and her husband's obvious indifference to her personally had created a volatile combination of desperation, rage, and religious fanaticism. Mary's persecution of Protestant heretics became increasingly personal and vindictive as she struggled to cope with her own failures and disappointments. Philip's departure also removed an important moderating influence on the persecution. While Philip supported Mary's religious objectives, he had been concerned about the economic and political costs of her methods. Some of his Spanish advisors had warned that the persecution was generating dangerous levels of opposition and might ultimately backfire. Without Philip's presence, Mary was free to pursue her campaign of terror without any restraint. By the end of 1555, Mary's persecution had developed into a well-oiled machine of death that was claiming victims at a rate of approximately one per week. The bureaucratic procedures had been streamlined, the legal justifications had been perfected, and the execution rituals had been standardized. What had begun as a campaign against prominent Protestant leaders had evolved into a systematic attempt to eliminate Protestant belief from English society through terror. The geographical spread of the persecution ensured that no part of England remained untouched by Mary's campaign. From the Scottish border to the English Channel, from the Welsh mountains to the Norfolk coast, the fires of persecution burned wherever Protestant ideas had taken root. Mary had succeeded in creating a reign of terror that reached into every corner of her kingdom as 1555 drew to a close. Approximately 70 Protestant reformers had been burned alive, with many more awaiting execution in prisons throughout England. The persecution that would eventually claim nearly 300 lives was well underway, and Mary showed no signs of moderating her policies. The woman who had once been known for her piety and learning was now feared throughout Europe as one of the most brutal persecutors of religious dissent in Christian history. The stage was set for the final phase of Mary's reign of terror, as the Queen prepared to escalate her persecution even further in a desperate attempt to achieve the complete Catholic restoration that continued to elude her. The fires of Smithfield would burn even brighter in the years to come, and the name Bloody Mary would be written in flames across the history of England. Sleep peacefully now, dear listener, as we prepare for part 3 of our journey through Mary's reign of terror. Close your eyes and let these dark whispers of history carry you into dreams. But remember, the worst is yet to come. The Queen who burned her people was just beginning to show the true depths of her cruelty, and the fires of persecution would soon reach their most terrifying intensity. Mary, later known as Queen Mary I of England, had by 1556 transformed her kingdom into a landscape of religious terror where the smoke of burning heretics darkened the skies above England's towns and cities. The systematic persecution that had begun tentatively in 1555 had evolved into an industrial-scale campaign of execution that would claim nearly 300 lives before Mary's death. The Queen, who had once been pitied as an illegitimate princess, had become the most feared monarch in English history. The year 1556 marked the zenith of what historians call the Marian persecution. During these 12 months, more Protestant reformers were burned alive than in any other period of Mary's reign. As her government perfected the machinery of religious terror and extended its reach into every corner of English society, the woman who would forever be known as Bloody Mary, was demonstrating the full extent of her commitment to Catholic restoration. Regardless of the human cost, the pace of executions during this period was relentless. Nearly every week brought news of fresh burnings, as Mary's ecclesiastical courts worked overtime to process the growing number of heresy cases. Smithfield in London remained the primary execution site, but fires also burned regularly in Canterbury, Oxford, Gloucester, Norwich, and dozens of smaller towns. No region of England was spared the terror that Mary hoped would purge her kingdom of Protestant heresy forever. The systematic nature of the persecution during this period revealed the bureaucratic efficiency that Mary's government had developed. In the machinery of death, standardized procedures governed every aspect of the process, from the initial denunciation of suspected heretics to their final moments at the stake. The Catholic Church had created a factory for producing martyrs, and it operated with the precision of a well-oiled machine designed for maximum terror and intimidation. Mary herself remained intimately involved in the persecution, reviewing individual cases and often personally deciding which heretics should be shown mercy and which should burn. Contemporary accounts describe her reading through lists of condemned prisoners like a general reviewing casualty reports, coldly calculating the political and religious impact of each execution. The woman who had once been praised for her piety had become a calculating orchestrator of systematic murder. On October 16, 1555, two of England's most prominent Protestant reformers met their deaths in what became one of the most famous executions of the Marian persecution. Hugh Latimer, the elderly former Bishop of Worcester, and Nicholas Ridley, the former Bishop of London, were burned together at Oxford in a carefully orchestrated spectacle designed to demonstrate the fate awaiting all who opposed Catholic restoration. The execution of Latimer and Ridley was planned as a public relations triumph for Mary's government, but it ultimately backfired spectacularly by creating two of the most celebrated Protestant martyrs in English history. The courage displayed by both men in their final moments, and particularly Latimer's famous last words to his companion, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle, by God's grace, in England, as I trust shall never be put out," provided powerful propaganda for the Protestant cause. Latimer, who was nearly 70 years old, had been one of the most influential preachers of the English Reformation. His sermons had helped shape Protestant theology in England, and his execution was intended to demonstrate that even the most respected Protestant leaders were not beyond the reach of Catholic justice. Mary's government hoped that by killing such prominent reformers, they would decapitate the Protestant movement and leave ordinary believers without leadership. Ridley, younger and more scholarly than his companion, had been instrumental in developing the theological foundations of English Protestantism. As Bishop of London under Edward VI, he had overseen the removal of Catholic practices from dozens of churches and had been a leading advocate for clerical marriage and communion in both kinds. His execution was Mary's revenge against those who had dismantled the Catholic system. She was now trying to restore. The actual mechanics of the execution revealed the calculated cruelty that characterized the Marian persecution. The two bishops were chained to the same stake, back to back, so that they could provide mutual comfort in their final moments, while also serving as a public spectacle for the assembled crowd. The executioners had positioned the wood carefully to ensure that the fire would burn slowly, prolonging the agony while maximizing the visual impact for spectators. Latimer died relatively quickly, suffocated by the smoke before the flames could reach him, but Ridley suffered terribly as the green wood burned too slowly to provide a merciful death. His agonized cries for the fire to come to him, and his repeated prayers for divine mercy, were heard by hundreds of witnesses who would carry the memory of his suffering for the rest of their lives. The execution that was meant to terrorize Protestants into submission instead created a powerful testimony to Protestant courage. The systematic spread of the persecution beyond London was exemplified by the burnings that took place in Canterbury throughout 1556 and 1557. This ancient cathedral city, the historic centre of English Christianity, became a focal point for Mary's campaign as her government sought to demonstrate that no place, however sacred, would be spared from the purification of heretical influences. Canterbury's strategic importance in the persecution went beyond mere symbolism. As the seat of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the location where Thomas Cranmer had been tried and condemned, the city represented the heart of the English Reformation that Mary was determined to destroy. The burnings that took place there were intended to erase the memory of Protestant reforms and restore Canterbury's status as a centre of Catholic orthodoxy. The most notorious of the Canterbury executions took place on June 18, 1557, when 6 Protestant reformers were burned together in a single massive fire outside the city walls. The execution was planned as a spectacular demonstration of Catholic power, with ecclesiastical authorities from across Kent attending to witness the destruction of heretical resistance. The 6 victims included both clergymen and lay people, demonstrating that Mary's persecution recognized no distinction of social status in its campaign against Protestant belief. Among the Canterbury martyrs was John Bradford, a former chaplain to Edward VI, who had been one of the most influential Protestant preachers of his generation. Bradford's execution was particularly significant because he had spent nearly 2 years in prison, during which time he had written extensively about his faith and had become a symbol of Protestant resistance. His final sermon, delivered from the stake as the flames were lit, was reported to have moved even some of his Catholic tormentors to tears. The Canterbury executions also included several women, highlighting the gender-blind nature of Mary's persecution. Protestant women were considered equally dangerous as men in their ability to spread heretical ideas, particularly through their role in educating children and managing households. The burning of women challenged traditional notions of chivalry and protection, revealing the radical extremism that drove Mary's religious policies. The aftermath of the Canterbury burnings demonstrated both the terror and the resistance that Mary's persecution was generating. While some local Catholics celebrated the destruction of heretical influences, many ordinary people were horrified by the systematic cruelty they had witnessed. Underground networks began forming to help potential victims escape the country, and Protestant literature critical of Mary's government began circulating secretly throughout the region. Oxford University, the ancient centre of English learning, became another focal point for Mary's persecution as her government sought to eliminate Protestant influences from England's educational institutions. The university that had produced many of the intellectual leaders of the English Reformation was systematically purged of Protestant scholars, with those who refused to recant their beliefs facing execution in the same city where they had once taught. The persecution of Oxford scholars began with the trial and execution of Thomas Cranmer in March 1556, but it continued throughout Mary's reign as her government worked to ensure that England's universities would produce only Catholic clergy and officials. Protestant professors were dismissed, Protestant students were expelled, and the libraries were purged of heretical books that had supported the Reformation. The execution of Protestant scholars was particularly significant because it targeted the intellectual foundations of the English Reformation. Mary's government understood that lasting Catholic restoration required not just the elimination of Protestant practices but the destruction of the Protestant theological and philosophical framework that supported them. By executing the scholars who had developed Protestant ideas, Mary hoped to prevent future generations from having access to heretical learning. One of the most poignant Oxford executions was that of Thomas Hawkes, a young scholar who had been preparing for ordination as a Protestant minister when Mary came to the throne. Hawkes was arrested while trying to flee the country and was brought back to Oxford for trial. His youth and evident sincerity made him a sympathetic figure, but Mary's government showed no mercy to those they considered dangerous heretics, regardless of their age or circumstances. The burning of scholars and students at Oxford sent a clear message to England's educated elite about the consequences of supporting Protestant ideas. The university that had been a center of humanist learning and religious reform was transformed into a symbol of Catholic orthodoxy and conformity. The intellectual freedom that had flourished during the early English Reformation was systematically destroyed by Mary's campaign of terror. Perhaps no aspect of the Marian persecution was more shocking to contemporary observers than Mary's willingness to execute women and children for heresy. Previous English rulers had generally shown reluctance to impose the death penalty on women and minors for religious offenses, but Mary's persecution made no such distinctions. Protestant women and children were considered equally dangerous as men in their ability to spread heretical ideas and corrupt society. The execution of women challenged traditional notions of female vulnerability and male protection that had generally provided some shelter for women accused of religious crimes. Mary's government argued that heretical women were actually more dangerous than men because of their role in educating children and their supposed greater susceptibility to demonic influences. This theological justification allowed the persecution to expand beyond its original focus on male clergy and scholars. Among the most tragic cases was that of Rose Lynn, a young woman from Essex who was arrested for refusing to attend Catholic Mass and for possessing Protestant books. When she refused to recant her beliefs, she was subjected to torture designed to break her spirit, including having her hand burned with a candle to demonstrate what awaited her at the stake. Despite this treatment, she maintained her Protestant faith and was eventually executed, becoming one of the youngest female martyrs of Mary's reign. The case of pregnant women presented particular challenges for Mary's persecutors, who had to balance their determination to eliminate heresy with traditional Christian prohibitions against executing pregnant women. In several instances, Mary's government kept pregnant Protestant women in prison until they gave birth, then executed them immediately afterward. These cases generated particular horror even among some Catholics who supported the persecution. In principle, perhaps most shocking of all were the cases involving children and teenagers. Mary's government argued that young heretics were actually more dangerous than adults, because they had longer to spread their false beliefs and corrupt others. Several teenagers were executed during the persecution, including some who were barely 16 years old. These executions demonstrated the radical extremism that had come to characterize Mary's religious policies. Smithfield, the historic meat market just outside London's city walls, became the most notorious execution site of the Marian persecution. Nearly half of all Protestant martyrs during Mary's reign were burned at Smithfield, making it a symbol of Catholic terror that would haunt English memory for centuries. The systematic nature of the executions there revealed the industrial scale that Mary's persecution had achieved by the height of her reign. The choice of Smithfield as the primary execution site was both practical and symbolic. The open space could accommodate large crowds of spectators, while the location outside the city walls provided a dramatic setting for the theater of terror that Mary's government was staging. The fact that it was traditionally used for butchering animals added to the symbolic impact of using it for human executions. The executions at Smithfield followed a carefully choreographed ritual designed to maximize both the deterrent effect and the religious message. Condemned heretics were brought from their prisons in a public procession, often accompanied by Catholic clergy who made final attempts to secure The journey to Smithfield provided additional opportunities for public humiliation and for demonstrating the power of Catholic authority. The actual burning process was deliberately designed to prolong suffering while maintaining the spectacle for crowds that sometimes numbered in the thousands. The condemned were chained to stakes and surrounded with carefully arranged bundles of wood and straw. The fires were lit simultaneously to create maximum visual impact, while the positioning of the wood was calculated to ensure that death would come slowly enough to allow for final prayers and potential last-minute recantations. Contemporary accounts describe the Smithfield executions as elaborate public ceremonies that combined religious ritual with political theatre. Catholic clergy delivered sermons explaining the theological justification for the executions, while government officials read proclamations warning of the consequences awaiting other heretics. The executions were intended to be both punishment for the condemned and education for the living. The frequency of Smithfield executions during the peak of Mary's persecution created a routine of terror that became part of London's weekly rhythm. Citizens became accustomed to the smoke of burning heretics and the sounds of religious ceremony mixed with human suffering. The normalization of extreme violence revealed how thoroughly Mary's government had transformed English society during her reign. The Marian persecution imposed enormous costs on English society that extended far beyond the immediate victims. The elaborate trials, the maintenance of prisoners awaiting execution, and the public ceremonies surrounding the burnings required significant resources at a time when England was already struggling financially. The persecution was not only morally devastating, but economically ruinous for communities forced to participate in the machinery of terror. Local communities were required to provide wood, labor, and facilities for executions, creating a network of complicity that extended throughout English society. Town officials were forced to participate in the persecution whether they supported it or not, while ordinary citizens were expected to attend executions as demonstrations of their loyalty to Catholic authority. The systematic nature of the campaign meant that no community could remain uninvolved in Mary's reign of terror. Perhaps most seriously for England's long-term economic health, the persecution was driving away skilled craftsmen, merchants, and professionals whose Protestant beliefs made them targets for Mary's campaign. The Protestant exile communities that formed in Protestant German cities, Swiss cantons, and the Low Countries included many of England's most talented and productive citizens. Their departure weakened England economically while strengthening Protestant powers that welcomed their skills and knowledge. The social impact of the persecution was equally devastating. Families were torn apart as some members fled the country while others remained to face potential execution. Neighborhoods were divided between those who supported the persecution and those who secretly sympathized with its victims. The trust and social cohesion that held communities together was systematically destroyed by Mary's campaign of terror. The psychological impact on English society was profound and lasting. An entire generation grew up witnessing systematic state violence against religious dissent, creating trauma that would influence English attitudes toward religious authority for decades. The persecution that Mary hoped would strengthen Catholic authority actually created deep suspicion of religious extremism that would benefit Protestant causes in the long term. The scale and brutality of the Marian persecution quickly attracted international attention, much of it negative even from Catholic powers who found Mary's methods excessive and counterproductive. While most Catholic rulers supported Mary's objectives in principle, many were concerned that her extreme tactics were generating more opposition than support for the Catholic cause and were damaging the broader reputation of Catholic rule. The French court despite its own campaigns against Protestant Huguenots, expressed private concerns about the English persecution's intensity. French diplomatic reports noted that Mary's methods were more systematic and brutal than those used in France's own religious campaigns. Some French Catholic observers worried that the English persecution might actually strengthen Protestant resolve rather than eliminating Protestant resistance. Italian reactions were similarly mixed, with papal representatives expressing support for Mary's objectives while privately questioning her methods. The Vatican was concerned that the English persecution was generating sympathy for Protestant martyrs, even among some Catholics who were horrified by the systematic cruelty being employed. Pope Paul IV, despite his own reputation for religious severity, privately expressed concerns that Mary's campaign might be doing more harm than good to the Catholic cause. Spanish reactions were more complex. Given Philip II's personal involvement in Mary's reign, while Philip supported his wife's religious policies in principle, some of his advisors warned that the persecution was generating dangerous levels of opposition and might ultimately prove counterproductive. Spanish diplomatic reports noted that the English persecution was more intense than similar campaigns in Spanish territories, including the notorious Spanish Inquisition. Protestant powers, meanwhile, used the Marian persecution as powerful propaganda against Catholic rule throughout Europe. German Protestant princes circulated detailed accounts of English martyrs to demonstrate the dangers of Catholic restoration, while Protestant refugees from England spread horror stories throughout Protestant Europe. The persecution that Mary hoped would demonstrate Catholic strength was actually undermining Catholic credibility and strengthening Protestant resolve. That the diplomatic consequences of the persecution extended beyond religious considerations to affect England's broader international relationships. The stream of Protestant refugees fleeing England created tensions with neighboring Protestant powers who were forced to accommodate these exiles. The persecution was transforming England from a potentially valuable ally into a source of regional instability and international concern, while the public burnings at Smithfield and other execution sites represented the visible face of Mary's persecution. The torture chambers where suspected heretics were interrogated revealed the systematic cruelty that characterized the entire campaign. Mary's government employed a range of physical and psychological torture techniques designed to break the will of Protestant prisoners and force them to recant their beliefs. The Tower of London became the primary center for the torture of Protestant prisoners, with its infamous dungeons housing dozens of condemned heretics at any given time. The conditions in these cells were deliberately harsh, with prisoners kept in darkness, fed minimal rations, and subjected to constant psychological pressure from Catholic clergy who sought to convince them to abandon their Protestant faith. Physical torture was employed systematically to extract confessions and recantations from stubborn heretics. The rack, the scavenger's daughter, and other mechanical devices were used to inflict excruciating pain while carefully avoiding immediate death. The goal was to break the prisoner's will without killing them, allowing them to serve as examples of Catholic mercy if they recanted, or as warnings to others if they maintained their heretical beliefs. Bishop Edmund Bonner, Mary's most notorious persecutor, became particularly infamous for his personal involvement in the torture of Protestant prisoners. Contemporary accounts describe Bonner personally interrogating prisoners, applying physical pressure, and even participating in their torture. His sadistic pleasure in inflicting pain on heretics earned him the nickname Bloody Bonner and made him one of the most hated figures of Mary's reign. The psychological torture employed during the persecution was often more effective than physical coercion in breaking prisoners' resistance. Suspected heretics were forced to watch the executions of their colleagues, were threatened with the torture of family members, and were subjected to elaborate theological arguments designed to undermine their faith. The combination of physical suffering and psychological pressure proved devastatingly effective in securing recantations. Perhaps most cruelly, prisoners who initially recanted under torture were often executed anyway if Mary's government decided that their previous heretical activities made them too dangerous to release. This practice of executing repentant heretics violated traditional church law and demonstrated the vindictive personal element that drove much of the persecution. Mary's campaign was motivated not just by religious conviction, but by a desire for revenge against those who had supported the Protestant reforms. Despite the terror of Mary's persecution, organized resistance networks began forming to help potential victims escape the country and to maintain Protestant communities in secret. These underground networks, operating with remarkable courage and efficiency, demonstrated that Mary's campaign was generating as much resistance as submission among England's Protestant population. The Protestant underground operated sophisticated escape routes that helped hundreds of potential victims flee to safety in Protestant territories on the continent. These networks included safe houses, coded communications, and carefully planned routes that avoided areas where Mary's agents were most active. The existence of such organized resistance revealed the depth of opposition to Mary's religious policies and the failure of terror to eliminate Protestant conviction. London became the center of underground Protestant activity, with secret congregations meeting in private homes, cellars, and abandoned buildings throughout the city. These illegal gatherings maintained Protestant worship traditions and provided mutual support for families whose members had been executed or had fled the country. The persistence of Protestant communities, despite systematic persecution, demonstrated the failure of Mary's campaign to achieve its objectives. The underground networks also maintained communication with Protestant exile communities on the continent, smuggling letters, money, and religious literature across the English Channel. These communications helped coordinate resistance activities and provided crucial intelligence about Mary's intentions and methods. The international dimension of Protestant resistance revealed that Mary's persecution was actually strengthening, rather than weakening Protestant organization. Protestant literature continued to circulate despite severe penalties for possession of heretical books. Underground printing presses produced translations of Protestant theological works, accounts of martyrs' deaths, and critiques of Catholic practices. This illegal literature helped maintain Protestant morale and provided theological justification for resistance to Mary's religious policies. The courage displayed by members of the Protestant underground was remarkable given the consequences of discovery. Those caught helping heretics escape or maintaining illegal congregations faced the same fate as the people they were trying to protect. Yet the networks continued to operate throughout Mary's reign, demonstrating that terror alone was insufficient to eliminate deeply held religious convictions. In early 1558, as Mary's persecution reached its peak intensity, the Queen announced that she was pregnant for a second time. This announcement, coming after the devastating failure of her first phantom pregnancy, revealed the desperate psychological state that was driving her increasingly extreme religious policies. Mary's need to produce a Catholic heir had become an obsession that influenced every aspect of her reign. The symptoms of Mary's second phantom pregnancy were similar to those of the first cessation of menstruation: weight gain and abdominal swelling. Court physicians again confirmed the pregnancy, and Mary herself was convinced that God was finally rewarding her faithful service with the gift of an heir. The Queen's desperation for a child had reached a point where she was willing to believe in miraculous intervention, despite all evidence to the contrary. The announcement of the pregnancy coincided with an intensification of the religious persecution, as Mary became convinced that God was testing her faith by demanding the complete elimination of heresy before blessing her with a child. The failed first pregnancy had been attributed to divine displeasure with England's incomplete Catholic restoration, and Mary was determined not to make the same mistake twice. Philip II's reaction to news of the second pregnancy was skeptical. From the beginning, his own physicians had informed him that Mary's symptoms were more likely indicators of serious illness than pregnancy, and he began making plans for the succession that assumed Mary would die childless. Philip's growing distance from his wife during this period added to Mary's emotional instability and her determination to prove her worthiness through religious extremism. As the months passed and no child was born, Mary's delusion became increasingly obvious to everyone except herself. Foreign ambassadors reported that the Queen's behavior was becoming erratic, with violent mood swings and obsessive focus on religious persecution. The woman who had once been praised for her learning and piety was descending into a state of psychological breakdown that affected her ability to govern effectively. The failure of the second phantom pregnancy in mid-1558 coincided with military disasters abroad and growing opposition at home that undermined Mary's authority. The Queen, who had staked everything on divine vindication of her policies, was forced to confront the possibility that God was not, in fact, supporting her reign. This realization would contribute to the final, most desperate phase of her persecution campaign. While Mary's domestic persecution was reaching its peak, her foreign policy was suffering catastrophic failures that undermined her international prestige and domestic authority. The loss of Calais to French forces in January 1558 was particularly devastating, as it eliminated England's last foothold on the continental mainland and dealt a crushing blow to English national pride. Calais had been in English hands for over 200 years, serving as both a strategic military base and a symbol of English power in Europe. Its loss was directly attributable to Mary's decision to support Philip II's wars against France, demonstrating how her marriage to the Spanish king had subordinated English interests to Spanish strategic objectives. The military disaster provided powerful ammunition for critics of Mary's policies. The fall of Calais was seen by many English people as divine punishment for Mary's religious persecution. Protestant propaganda linked the military defeat to God's displeasure with the burning of innocent heretics, while even some Catholics began to question whether Mary's extreme policies were bringing divine favor or divine wrath upon England. The Queen's claim to be serving God's will was undermined by her apparent inability to secure God's protection for English territory. Mary's reaction to the loss of Calais revealed the psychological pressure she was experiencing as her reign entered its final phase. According to contemporary accounts, she declared that when she died, they would find Calais written on her heart, indicating the personal devastation she felt at this military humiliation. The Queen, who had promised to restore England's glory, was leaving the kingdom weaker and more isolated than she had found it. The strategic implications of losing Calais extended beyond immediate military concerns to affect England's long-term position in European politics. Without a continental foothold, England was reduced to the status of an offshore island with limited ability to influence European affairs. Mary's pursuit of Spanish alliance had cost England its continental presence and reduced its strategic options for generations to come. Even as Mary's health declined rapidly in 1558, the persecution continued at an undiminished pace. The Queen's determination to complete her work of Catholic restoration meant that suspected heretics continued to be arrested, tried, and executed right up until her death. The final months of Mary's reign saw some of the most cruel and pointless executions of the entire persecution, as her government rushed to eliminate as many Protestant influences as possible. Among the final victims were several elderly men and women, whose only crime was refusing to attend Catholic Mass or possessing Protestant books. These executions served no strategic purpose and generated widespread revulsion, even among some Catholics who had previously supported the persecution. The systematic cruelty had reached a point where it was damaging rather than supporting the Catholic cause. The execution of pregnant women continued during this final phase, with Mary's government showing no mercy, even to those whose condition had traditionally provided protection from the death penalty. The burning of expectant mothers represented the ultimate extremism of Mary's campaign and demonstrated how far she was willing to go in pursuit of religious purification. Perhaps most tragically, several teenagers were executed during the final months of Mary's reign, including some who were barely old enough to understand the theological issues for which they were dying. These executions of children revealed the complete abandonment of traditional Christian mercy that characterized the end of Mary's persecution campaign. The psychological impact of these final executions on English society was profound. People who had initially supported or tolerated the persecution began to turn against Mary's government as the campaign's extremism became undeniable. The Queen, who had hoped to unite England under Catholic authority, was instead creating lasting trauma that would influence English attitudes toward religious extremism for centuries. As news of Mary's persecution spread throughout Protestant Europe, international pressure began building for intervention to protect English Protestants. While no foreign power was willing to risk war with England directly, Protestant governments provided sanctuary for English refugees and used the persecution as propaganda against Catholic rule throughout Europe. The city of Geneva, under the leadership of John Calvin, became a major center for English Protestant exiles who fled Mary's persecution. These refugees included many of England's most talented scholars, clergy, and administrators, whose departure weakened England while strengthening Protestant territories that welcomed their skills. The intellectual capital that fled England during Mary's reign represented an enormous loss to the kingdom's future development. Protestant governments in Germany provided both sanctuary and financial support for English refugees, seeing their protection as part of the broader struggle against Catholic expansion in Europe. The existence of thriving English Protestant communities in continental cities served as a constant reminder of the failure of Mary's policies and provided a foundation for future Protestant restoration in England. The English exile communities maintained extensive correspondence networks that kept Protestant resistance alive within England itself. Letters, money, and religious literature flowed regularly between the exile communities and underground Protestant networks in England, providing both material support and moral encouragement for those facing persecution. Perhaps most importantly, the exile communities were documenting the persecution in detail, collecting testimonies from survivors and witnesses that would eventually be compiled into powerful propaganda against Catholic rule. These accounts would form the basis for John Fox's Acts and Monuments. The influential martyrology that would ensure Mary's persecution would be remembered as one of the most shameful episodes in English history. By 1558, the combined effects of religious persecution, foreign war, and administrative incompetence had brought England to the brink of economic collapse. The costs of maintaining the persecution, fighting Philip's wars, and compensating for the flight of skilled workers had exhausted the royal treasury and created widespread economic hardship throughout the kingdom. The departure of Protestant merchants, craftsmen, and professionals had seriously damaged England's economy, particularly in the cloth trade that was the foundation of English prosperity. Entire industries were disrupted as skilled workers fled the country, while the persecution created an atmosphere of uncertainty that discouraged investment and economic development. Agricultural production was also affected by the persecution, as Protestant farmers and landowners either fled the country or were executed for their beliefs. The disruption of rural communities, combined with poor harvests caused by unfavorable weather, created food shortages that added to the general misery of Mary's reign. The financial cost of the persecution itself was enormous, requiring significant expenditures for trials, imprisonments, and executions at a time when the royal treasury was already strained by foreign wars. The elaborate ceremonies surrounding the burnings, while serving important propaganda purposes, represented a significant drain on resources that might have been used for more productive purposes. Mary's government was forced to debase the currency and impose new taxes to fund its activities, creating inflation and economic hardship that affected every level of society. The Queen, who had promised to restore England's greatness, was leaving the kingdom, economically weakened and financially exhausted as Mary's reign entered its final phase. Contemporary observers noted dramatic changes in her behavior that suggested serious psychological deterioration. The combination of physical illness, political failures, and the stress of orchestrating systematic persecution had taken a severe toll on the Queen's mental health. The woman who had once been praised for her learning and dignity was becoming increasingly erratic and unpredictable. Mary's obsession with the persecution had reached pathological levels, with the Queen reportedly spending hours each day reviewing lists of condemned heretics and planning new executions. Her personal involvement in the details of torture and execution revealed a sadistic element that shocked even some of her supporters. The pious Catholic princess had been transformed into a monster who took personal pleasure in the suffering of her victims. The Queen's relationship with reality became increasingly tenuous as her phantom pregnancies, military defeats, and husband's abandonment created cognitive dissonance that she could not resolve. Rather than acknowledging the failure of her policies, Mary doubled down on persecution as the solution to all her problems. The psychological defense mechanism of denial was preventing her from recognizing the destructive consequences of her own actions. Contemporary accounts describe Mary's physical appearance during this period as gaunt and haggard, with the stress of her reign visible in her prematurely aged features. The woman who had once been noted for her beauty and grace had been worn down by the psychological burden of orchestrating systematic terror. The cost of becoming Bloody Mary was evident in every aspect of her deteriorating condition. Mary's isolation at court became increasingly complete as even her closest advisors began to distance themselves from her most extreme policies. The Queen, who had demanded absolute loyalty, was finding that terror was an ineffective foundation for building lasting political support. The psychological breakdown of the tyrant was becoming apparent to everyone except herself. Even as Mary lay dying in November 1558, her persecution machinery continued to operate with mechanical efficiency. The final executions of her reign took place just days before her death, demonstrating the systematic nature of the terror she had created and her determination to continue the persecution until the very end of her life. The last victims of Mary's persecution included ordinary men and women, whose only crime was maintaining their Protestant faith in the face of overwhelming pressure to conform. These final executions served no strategic purpose and accomplished nothing except adding to the total death toll of Mary's campaign. The Queen's inability to show mercy even in her final moments revealed the complete dehumanization that her persecution had produced. Perhaps most tragically, some of the final victims were people who had been in prison for years, waiting for their trials to conclude. The bureaucratic machinery of persecution had become so complex and slow-moving that many prisoners had languished in horrible conditions for months or years before finally being brought to execution. The systematic nature of the terror had created its own momentum that continued regardless of changing circumstances. The psychological impact of these final executions on English society was devastating. People who had hoped that Mary's illness might lead to a moderation of the persecution were forced to confront the reality that the Queen intended to continue burning heretics until her last breath. The complete absence of mercy or flexibility in Mary's approach had created a reign of terror that knew no bounds. The news that executions were continuing even as Mary lay dying spread rapidly throughout England and Europe, cementing her reputation as one of history's most ruthless persecutors. The woman who had hoped to be remembered as the restorer of Catholic England would instead be remembered forever as Bloody Mary, the Queen who burned her people without mercy or restraint. As the fires of Smithfield burned for the final time under Mary's reign, England prepared for the end of an era of terror that had traumatized an entire generation. The Queen who had promised religious restoration had delivered only death and destruction, and her approaching death was anticipated with relief rather than mourning by most of her subjects. Sleep now, dear listener, as we prepare for the final chapter of our journey through Mary's reign of terror. Close your eyes and let these dark memories fade into peaceful dreams. But remember, the end is finally approaching for the Queen who burned her people. In Part 4, we will witness the death of Bloody Mary and explore how her legacy of terror would haunt England for generations to come. Mary, later known as Queen Mary I of England, entered the final year of her life in 1558 as a broken woman whose reign of terror had consumed not only hundreds of innocent victims, but also her own soul. The Queen, who had once been beloved as her father's pearl of the world, was now feared throughout Europe as Bloody Mary, a tyrant whose name had become synonymous with religious persecution and systematic cruelty. As Mary's health deteriorated rapidly throughout 1558, her persecution of Protestant heretics intensified rather than diminished. The dying Queen seemed determined to burn as many victims as possible before death claimed her, as if she hoped that a final surge of terror would somehow complete the Catholic restoration that had eluded her throughout her 5-year reign. The machinery of death that she had created continued to operate with mechanical efficiency, even as its architect lay dying. The Queen's physical condition during this period was a testament to the psychological and spiritual cost of orchestrating systematic murder. Contemporary accounts describe Mary as gaunt and haggard, her once beautiful features worn down by years of stress and the burden of guilt that came with ordering the deaths of hundreds of innocent people. The woman who had claimed to serve God through persecution was discovering that evil exacted a terrible price from those who embraced it. Mary's obsession with the persecution had reached pathological levels by 1558. She reportedly spent hours each day reviewing lists of condemned prisoners, personally deciding which heretics should be executed and which should be offered final opportunities to recant. The Queen's direct involvement in the details of torture and execution revealed a sadistic element that had developed over years of systematic cruelty. The isolation that surrounded Mary during her final months was both physical and spiritual. Even her closest Catholic advisors had begun to distance themselves from her most extreme policies, recognizing that the persecution was generating more opposition than support for the Catholic cause. The Queen, who had demanded absolute loyalty, was discovering that terror was an inadequate foundation for building lasting political relationships. Philip II's continued absence from England during this period added to Mary's emotional instability and desperation. Her Spanish husband had made it clear that he considered their marriage a failure, both personally and politically, and he was already making plans for England's future that did not include Mary. The woman who had sacrificed everything for love was learning that political marriages offered little genuine affection or support. the influenza epidemic that swept through England in the autumn of 1558 was seen by many as divine judgment upon Mary's reign of terror. The disease struck with particular severity in London, where the smoke from Smithfield's fires had been darkening the skies for 3 years. Protestant propaganda suggested that God was punishing England for the innocent blood that had been shed in the name of religious orthodoxy. Mary herself became ill with influenza in late October 1558, though her condition was complicated by what modern historians believe were symptoms of ovarian or uterine cancer that had been developing for years. The combination of disease and underlying illness created a rapid decline that made it clear to everyone except Mary herself that her death was imminent. The Queen's reaction to her illness revealed the depth of her delusion about the success of her religious policies. Rather than seeing her condition as possible divine displeasure with the persecution, Mary interpreted her suffering as a test of faith that required even greater commitment to eliminating heresy. Some of the most cruel executions of her entire reign took place during her final illness, as she rushed to complete what she saw as her divinely appointed mission. Cardinal Reginald Pole, Mary's closest religious advisor and partner in persecution, also fell ill with influenza during this same period. The simultaneous illness of the two architects of the Marian persecution was seen by many as providential justice, though Mary herself remained convinced that they were both suffering for England's incomplete purification from Protestant heresy. The spread of the epidemic throughout England created additional challenges for Mary's persecutors, as many potential victims died of natural causes before they could be brought to trial and execution. The irony was not lost on Protestant observers. That disease was accomplishing what mercy had failed to achieve, sparing some of Mary's intended victims from the flames of Smithfield. Even as Mary lay on her deathbed at St. James's Palace, the persecution machinery she had created continued to operate with ruthless efficiency. The final executions of her reign took place in November 1558, just days before her death, demonstrating the systematic nature of the terror she had instituted and her determination to continue burning heretics until her last breath. The last victims of Mary's persecution included men and women who had been in prison for months or years, waiting for trials that had been delayed by the overwhelming number of cases flooding the ecclesiastical courts. The bureaucratic machinery of persecution had become so complex and slow-moving that many prisoners had languished in horrible conditions for extended periods before finally being brought to their deaths. Among the final victims were several elderly Protestants whose only crimes were refusing to attend Catholic Mass or possessing banned religious books. These executions served no strategic purpose and accomplished nothing except adding to the total death toll of Mary's campaign. The complete absence of mercy or proportionality in these final cases revealed how thoroughly the persecution had dehumanized both its victims and its perpetrators. Perhaps most cruelly, some of the last executions involved pregnant women who had been kept in prison until they gave birth, then immediately brought to the stake. The burning of new mothers represented the ultimate extremism of Mary's campaign and demonstrated how far she was willing to go in pursuit of what she saw as religious purification. These cases generated revulsion even among some Catholics who had previously supported the persecution. The psychological impact of continuing executions while the Queen lay dying was devastating for English society. People who had hoped that Mary's illness might lead to a moderation of the persecution were forced to confront the reality that she intended to burn heretics until the very end of her life. The systematic nature of the terror had created a momentum that continued regardless of changing circumstances. News that executions were continuing, even as Mary approached death, spread rapidly throughout England and Europe, cementing her reputation as one of history's most relentless persecutors. The woman who had hoped to be remembered as the restorer of Catholic England would instead be remembered forever as Bloody Mary, the Queen who showed no mercy even in her final moments. On November 17, 1558, Mary Tudor died at St. James's Palace, bringing to an end one of the most terrifying reigns in English history. Her death was not mourned by the English people, who had endured 5 years of systematic, religious persecution that had claimed nearly 300 lives and traumatized an entire generation. The woman who had once been welcomed as the rightful queen was leaving the world as one of its most hated tyrants. Mary's final hours were reportedly spent in prayer and religious devotion, as she clung to the belief that her persecution of Protestant heretics had been divinely ordained and necessary for England's spiritual salvation. She showed no signs of repentance for the suffering she had caused, maintaining until the end her conviction that burning heretics was a holy duty that would earn her divine reward. The Queen's last will and testament revealed the extent to which religious persecution had consumed her thoughts during her final years. She left instructions for continued masses to be said for her soul and for the souls of her parents, but made no provision for mercy toward the Protestant prisoners who remained in her jails awaiting execution. Even in death, Mary's priorities remained focused on religious orthodoxy rather than human compassion. Cardinal Reginald Pole, Mary's partner in persecution, died on the same day as the Queen, a coincidence that was seen by many as divine justice. The simultaneous deaths of the two architects of the Marian persecution marked the end of an era of religious terror that had defined Mary's reign and traumatized English society. Philip II's reaction to news of his wife's death was notably restrained. According to Spanish diplomatic records, he expressed reasonable regret for Mary's passing, but immediately began negotiations to marry her successor, Elizabeth I, demonstrating the purely political nature of his relationship with Mary. The woman, who had sacrificed everything for love, discovered too late that she had been used for strategic advantage. The circumstances of Mary's death, dying alone and unloved after years of systematic cruelty, provided a stark contrast to the heroic deaths of many of her victims. While Protestant martyrs had gone to their deaths with prayers and songs, surrounded by sympathetic crowds, Mary died in isolation, feared and despised by most of her subjects. Within hours of Mary's death, her half-sister Elizabeth was proclaimed Queen of England, bringing immediate hope for an end to the religious persecution that had terrorized the kingdom for 5 years. Elizabeth's accession was greeted with spontaneous celebrations throughout England, as people who had lived in fear of denunciation and execution finally dared to express their relief that the reign of terror was over. One of Elizabeth's first acts as queen was to order the release of Protestant prisoners who had been awaiting execution in jails throughout England. The sight of these survivors emerging from Mary's dungeons provided powerful testimony to the systematic nature of the persecution and the narrow escape that England itself had experienced from continued religious terror. Elizabeth's approach to religious settlement was deliberately moderate, avoiding the extremism that had characterized both her half-brother Edward's Protestant reforms and her half-sister Mary's Catholic restoration. The new queen understood that England had been traumatized by religious warfare and needed healing rather than continued persecution. Her religious settlement would establish a middle way that avoided the fanaticism that had made Mary's reign so terrifying. The contrast between the two sisters' approaches to religious authority could not have been more stark. Where Mary had used fire and sword to impose her religious vision, Elizabeth relied on compromise and gradual change. Where Mary had shown no mercy to religious opponents, Elizabeth offered amnesty and opportunities for reconciliation. The difference between tyranny and statesmanship was immediately apparent to English observers. International reactions to Elizabeth's accession were overwhelmingly positive. particularly among Protestant powers who had watched Mary's persecution with horror. The new Queen's moderate approach to religious issues promised to restore England's reputation and end its isolation from Protestant Europe. The reign of terror that had damaged England's international standing was finally over. The complete statistics of Mary's persecution reveal the systematic nature of the terror she inflicted upon England. During her 5-year reign, approximately 280 Protestant reformers were burned alive for their religious beliefs, while hundreds more died in prison awaiting trial or execution. The scale of the persecution was unprecedented in English history and would never be repeated. The victims of Mary's persecution came from every level of English society, demonstrating the comprehensive nature of her campaign against Protestant belief. Prominent bishops and scholars were burned alongside ordinary farmers, weavers, and servants. Women comprised nearly 1/5 of the victims, while several teenagers were also executed, revealing the gender-blind and age-blind nature of Mary's extremism. The geographical distribution of the executions showed that no part of England was spared from Mary's campaign. While London's Smithfield remained the primary execution site, Protestant martyrs were also burned in Canterbury, Oxford, Gloucester, Norwich, Coventry, and dozens of smaller towns. The systematic spread of terror ensured that every community witnessed the consequences of opposing Catholic authority. The economic cost of the persecution was enormous, requiring significant expenditures for trials, imprisonments, and executions at a time when England was already struggling financially. The elaborate ceremonies surrounding the burnings, while serving propaganda purposes, represented a massive drain on resources that might have been used more productively. Perhaps most significantly, the persecution drove hundreds of England's most talented citizens into exile, weakening the kingdom while strengthening Protestant powers that welcomed these refugees. The intellectual and economic capital that fled England during Mary's reign represented an enormous loss that would take decades to recover. The systematic documentation of Mary's persecution by Protestant observers created one of the most influential books in English history. John Foxe's Acts and Monuments, better known as Foxe's Book of Martyrs, compiled detailed accounts of the executions and provided powerful propaganda that would ensure Mary's reputation as a tyrant for centuries to come. Foxe's work was based on extensive research, including interviews with survivors, eyewitness accounts, and official records of the trials and executions. The book provided graphic descriptions of the burnings, emphasizing the courage and faith of the victims while highlighting the cruelty of their persecutors. The detailed woodcut illustrations that accompanied the text created vivid visual representations of the persecution that burned themselves into English memory. The impact of Foxe's book was immediate and lasting. Within a few years of its publication, it had become one of the most widely read books in England, second only to the Bible in its influence on English Protestant thought. The book was required reading in churches and was found in most educated households throughout the Protestant world. The martyrology created by Foxe transformed Mary's victims from forgotten casualties into celebrated heroes of the Protestant faith. Their stories became part of English folklore, passed down through generations as examples of faithful resistance to tyranny. The persecution that Mary had hoped would eliminate Protestant memory instead created an imperishable record of Protestant heroism. Perhaps most importantly, Foxe's book established the narrative framework through which Mary's reign would be remembered by subsequent generations. The image of Bloody Mary as a cruel tyrant who burned innocent people for their faith became fixed in English consciousness and would influence attitudes toward religious extremism for centuries to come. Mary's persecution had international consequences that extended far beyond England's borders. The systematic nature of her campaign against Protestant believers created a reputation for religious extremism that damaged Catholic credibility throughout Europe and strengthened Protestant resolve in the broader religious conflicts of the 16th century. Protestant powers used accounts of the Marian persecution as powerful propaganda against Catholic rule, circulating detailed descriptions of the burnings to demonstrate the dangers of Catholic restoration. The persecution became a symbol of Catholic tyranny that was used to justify Protestant resistance movements throughout Europe. Even Catholic powers were embarrassed by the extremism of Mary's methods. While most Catholic rulers supported her objectives in principle, many privately criticized her tactics as counterproductive and damaging to the broader Catholic cause. The Spanish Inquisition, despite its own reputation for brutality, was seen as more restrained than Mary's persecution. The stream of Protestant refugees who fled England during Mary's reign carried first-hand accounts of the persecution throughout Protestant Europe. These exiles became living testimony to Catholic cruelty and helped generate international sympathy for Protestant causes. The diaspora, created by Mary's terror, became a powerful force for Protestant propaganda. The diplomatic isolation that resulted from Mary's persecution damaged England's international position for years after her death. Elizabeth I would spend much of her early reign rebuilding relationships with European powers who had been alienated by her sister's extremism. The reputation for religious fanaticism created by Mary's persecution took decades to overcome. The psychological impact of Mary's persecution on English society was profound and lasting. An entire generation had grown up witnessing systematic state violence against religious dissent, creating trauma that would influence English attitudes toward religious authority for decades to come. Children who had witnessed the burnings at Smithfield and other execution sites carried these memories throughout their lives, often developing deep suspicion of religious extremism in any form. The systematic cruelty they had observed taught them that religious fanaticism, whether Catholic or Protestant, posed dangers to human dignity and social stability. Families had been torn apart by the persecution, with some members fleeing the country while others remained to face potential execution. Communities had been divided between those who supported the persecution and those who secretly sympathized with its victims. The social trust and cohesion that held English society together had been severely damaged by Mary's campaign of terror. The normalization of extreme violence during Mary's reign had disturbing consequences for English society. Citizens had become accustomed to witnessing systematic torture and execution, creating a culture of brutality that would take years to overcome. The dehumanization that was necessary for the persecution to continue had affected not only its direct participants, but the entire society that witnessed it. Perhaps most tragically, Mary's persecution had achieved the opposite of its intended purpose. Rather than uniting England under Catholic authority, it had created deep and lasting divisions that would influence English religious and political development for centuries. The Queen, who had hoped to heal England's religious wounds, had instead inflicted trauma that would take generations to overcome. Mary's systematic persecution of Protestant believers represents one of history's most complete examples of how terror fails to achieve its political and religious objectives. Despite 5 years of unprecedented violence and the execution of nearly 300 people, Mary's campaign not only failed to restore Catholic England, but actually strengthened Protestant resistance and created lasting opposition to religious extremism. The fundamental flaw in Mary's approach was her misunderstanding of the nature of religious belief. She assumed that fear of death would overcome religious conviction, but the heroic deaths of Protestant martyrs actually strengthened rather than weakened Protestant resolve. Each execution created new martyrs, whose courage inspired others to maintain their faith despite the threat of persecution. The systematic nature of the persecution also revealed its political impossibility. Mary's government simply lacked the resources and administrative capacity to identify and eliminate every Protestant believer in England. The attempt to achieve religious uniformity through terror required a level of state surveillance and control that was impossible to maintain with 16th century technology and bureaucracy. Perhaps most importantly, Mary's persecution generated significant opposition even among Catholics who found her methods excessive and counterproductive. The systematic cruelty of the campaign alienated potential supporters and created sympathy for Protestant victims that undermined Catholic authority. The persecution that was intended to demonstrate Catholic strength actually revealed Catholic weakness and moral bankruptcy. The international dimension of the persecution's failure was equally significant. Rather than inspiring Catholic powers to adopt similar policies, Mary's examples served as a warning about the dangers of religious extremism. Even the Spanish Inquisition, despite its own reputation for brutality, was more restrained than Mary's persecution and achieved greater success through more selective targeting. The economic and social costs of the persecution also contributed to its failure. The campaign required enormous resources that England could not afford, while the flight of skilled Protestant craftsmen and merchants weakened the kingdom economically. Mary's religious objectives were undermining the practical foundations of effective governance. The transformation of Mary Tudor from a sympathetic figure, an illegitimate princess who had overcome tremendous obstacles to claim her rightful throne, into the monster known as Bloody Mary, represents one of the most dramatic character assassinations in English history. This transformation was not accidental, but resulted from a systematic campaign by Protestant propagandists to ensure that Mary's persecution would never be forgotten or forgiven. John Fox's acts and monuments played the crucial role in creating the Bloody Mary legend. Fox's detailed accounts of the persecution, accompanied by graphic illustrations of the burnings, created a powerful and lasting image of Mary as a cruel tyrant who took personal pleasure in the suffering of innocent people. The book's wide circulation ensured that this image became fixed in English popular consciousness. The nickname Bloody Mary itself did not appear immediately after Mary's death, but developed gradually as Protestant writers emphasized the violent nature of her reign. By the 17th century, the name had become so associated with Mary that it was used routinely by historians and popular writers. The transformation from Queen Mary to Bloody Mary reflected the complete victory of Protestant propaganda in shaping historical memory. The legend of Bloody Mary was enhanced by the contrast with her successor, Elizabeth I, whose long and successful reign provided a stark alternative to Mary's brief and disastrous rule. Elizabeth's moderation in religious matters, her military victories over Catholic Spain, and her promotion of English prosperity all served to highlight Mary's failures and reinforce her reputation as a tyrannical fanatic. Popular culture also contributed to the development of the Bloody Mary legend. Folk tales, ballads, and eventually children's stories preserved the memory of Mary's persecution in forms that reached beyond educated elites to influence popular consciousness. The Queen, who had hoped to be remembered as a restorer, became instead a figure of terror in English folklore. The persistence of the Bloody Mary legend into modern times demonstrates the lasting impact of systematic persecution on historical memory. Mary's 5-year reign of terror created trauma that influenced English attitudes toward religious authority for centuries, making her name synonymous with fanaticism and cruelty. Long after the specific details of her persecution had been forgotten, Elizabeth's approach to religious settlement provided a stark contrast to her sister's methods and demonstrated how religious differences could be managed without resorting to systematic persecution. The Elizabethan religious settlement established in the early years of Elizabeth's reign, offered a middle way that avoided the extremism that had characterized both Edward VI's Protestant reforms and Mary's Catholic restoration. Elizabeth's settlement was based on the principle of outward conformity rather than inner belief. Unlike Mary, who had demanded that her subjects genuinely embrace Catholic doctrine, Elizabeth required only that they attend Protestant services and avoid open displays of Catholic practice. This approach recognized the impossibility of controlling private religious belief while maintaining public religious unity. The new Queen's treatment of Catholics demonstrated the difference between persecution and toleration. While Elizabeth did not permit public Catholic worship, she did not systematically hunt down and execute Catholics simply for their beliefs. Only those Catholics who actively plotted against her rule or who openly defied her religious authority faced serious persecution. Elizabeth's approach was also more flexible and pragmatic than Mary's rigid orthodoxy. The Queen was willing to make compromises and adjustments to her religious policies when circumstances required, demonstrating the kind of political wisdom that Mary had utterly lacked. This flexibility allowed Elizabeth to maintain religious stability for over 40 years. The success of Elizabeth's religious settlement vindicated those who had criticized Mary's methods as counterproductive. By avoiding systematic persecution, Elizabeth was able to achieve the religious unity that had eluded Mary despite her campaign of terror. The contrast between the two sisters' approaches became a powerful argument for moderation and tolerance in religious matters. Mary's persecution took place during a period of intense religious conflict throughout Europe. As Catholic and Protestant powers struggled for dominance in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation. Understanding Mary's campaign within this broader context helps explain both its origins and its ultimate failure to achieve lasting success. The French Wars of Religion, which began shortly after Mary's death, demonstrated that religious persecution was not unique to England but was part of a broader pattern of religious violence that characterized 16th century Europe. However, the French conflicts also revealed the limitations of using terror to resolve religious differences, as decades of violence failed to eliminate either Catholic or Protestant communities. The Spanish Inquisition provided the model for Mary's persecution, but its greater success was based on different circumstances that did not exist in England. Spain's religious minorities were smaller and less well organized than English Protestants, while Spanish society was more unified. In its support for religious orthodoxy, Mary's attempt to transplant Spanish methods to English soil was doomed to failure. The German religious wars demonstrated the international dimensions of religious conflict and dangers of extremism for political stability. The devastation caused by religious warfare in Germany served as a warning to other European rulers about the costs of pursuing religious purity through violence. Mary's persecution was part of this broader pattern of destructive religious conflict. The Dutch revolt against Spanish rule, which began during Mary's reign, showed how religious persecution could create rather than eliminate political opposition. Spanish attempts to suppress Protestant heresy in the Netherlands through systematic violence ultimately provoked a successful independence movement. Mary's persecution risked creating similar resistance in England. The broader European experience with religious persecution demonstrated that terror was an ineffective tool for achieving lasting religious settlement. Those rulers who successfully managed religious diversity through compromise and moderation achieved greater stability than those who pursued religious purity through violence. Mary's persecution imposed enormous economic costs on England that extended far beyond the immediate expenses of trials, imprisonments, and executions. The systematic campaign against Protestant believers disrupted English society and economy in ways that took decades to repair. demonstrating how religious extremism undermines the practical foundations of effective governance. The flight of Protestant craftsmen, merchants, and professionals during Mary's reign represented a massive loss of human capital that weakened England economically while strengthening Protestant territories that welcomed these refugees. Cities like Geneva, Frankfurt, and Emden benefited enormously from the influx of skilled English workers who brought valuable knowledge and connections to their new homes. The disruption of trade relationships was another significant cost of Mary's persecution. English Protestant merchants, who had developed important commercial connections in Protestant Europe, were forced to abandon these relationships. While there, Catholic replacements often lacked the experience and contacts necessary to maintain profitable trade. The persecution damaged England's commercial networks at a time when international trade was becoming increasingly important. The administrative costs of the persecution were also substantial. The elaborate trials, the maintenance of prisoners awaiting execution, and the public ceremonies surrounding the burnings required significant resources that might have been used more productively. The ecclesiastical courts that processed heresy cases consumed time and money that could have been devoted to other governmental functions. The uncertainty created by the persecution discouraged investment and economic development throughout England. Merchants and craftsmen who feared denunciation and execution were reluctant to make long-term investments or expand their businesses. The climate of terror created by Mary's campaign had a chilling effect on economic activity that lasted throughout her reign. The contrast with Elizabeth's reign demonstrated the economic benefits of religious moderation. Elizabeth's more tolerant policies encouraged the return of Protestant exiles and attracted foreign investment from Protestant powers. The economic recovery that characterized Elizabeth's early reign was partly attributable to the end of religious persecution and the restoration of confidence in England's stability. Mary's persecution had important constitutional implications that influenced English political development long after her death. Her systematic use of royal authority to suppress religious dissent raised fundamental questions about the limits of monarchical power and the rights of subjects to resist. Tyrannical government. The legal framework used for the persecution stretched traditional concepts of treason and heresy to their breaking point. Mary's government expanded the definition of heresy to include not only theological dissent, but also political opposition to royal religious policies. This expansion of royal authority over religious matters set dangerous precedents for future monarchs who might be tempted to abuse their power. The resistance networks that developed during Mary's persecution demonstrated the potential for organized opposition to tyrannical government. The underground Protestant communities that maintained illegal worship and helped potential victims escape the country provided models for political resistance that would influence future opposition movements. The international dimension of resistance to Mary's persecution also had constitutional implications. The protection provided by foreign Protestant powers to English religious refugees established precedents for international intervention in cases of domestic tyranny. These precedents would influence later developments in international law regarding human rights and religious freedom. The documentation of Mary's persecution by Protestant observers created a powerful critique of tyrannical government that influenced English political thought for generations. The detailed accounts of systematic cruelty served as warnings about the dangers of absolute royal authority and the importance of constitutional limitations on monarchical power. Elizabeth's more moderate approach to religious authority demonstrated alternative models of governance that emphasized consent and compromise rather than coercion and terror. The success of Elizabeth's methods provided practical arguments for constitutional monarchy and limited government that would influence English political development throughout the early modern period. The cultural memory of Mary's persecution became a defining element of English Protestant identity that influenced English attitudes toward religious authority, political power, and national identity for centuries. The systematic documentation and commemoration of the Marian persecution created a shared narrative of suffering and resistance that shaped English cultural development in profound ways. Fox's Book of Martyrs became second only to the Bible in its influence on English Protestant thought and culture. The book was read aloud in churches, studied in schools, and found in most Protestant households throughout England. The martyrs' stories became part of English folklore, passed down through generations as examples of faithful resistance to tyranny. The anniversary of Mary's death became an unofficial Protestant holiday, celebrated with bonfires and festivities that commemorated the end of persecution. These celebrations reinforced popular memory of Mary's tyranny and ensured that each new generation learned about the dangers of religious extremism. The cultural ritual of remembrance kept Mary's reputation as a tyrant alive in popular consciousness. The contrast between Catholic and Protestant versions of Mary's reign created competing narratives about English religious and political development. While Protestant accounts emphasized Mary's cruelty and failure, Catholic writers attempted to rehabilitate her reputation by emphasizing her piety and the theological justification for her policies. These competing narratives reflected broader cultural conflicts about English identity and values. The influence of the Marian persecution on English literature was substantial and lasting. Writers from Shakespeare to Milton drew on the memory of religious persecution to explore themes of tyranny, resistance, and moral courage. The persecution provided a rich source of dramatic material that resonated with English audiences who understood its historical significance. The popular culture surrounding the Bloody Mary legend also contributed to English cultural memory of the persecution. Ghost stories, folk tales, and eventually children's games preserved the memory of Mary's tyranny in forms that reached beyond historical scholarship to influence popular consciousness. The Queen, who had hoped to be remembered as a restorer, became instead a figure of terror in English cultural imagination. Modern historical scholarship has attempted to provide a more balanced assessment of Mary's reign, considering the religious and political context of 16th century Europe while not excusing the systematic cruelty of her persecution. This scholarly reassessment has revealed the complexity of Mary's character and motivations while confirming the essential accuracy of contemporary Protestant accounts of her tyranny. The psychological analysis of Mary's behavior during her reign has provided insights into the personal factors that contributed to her extremism. Her traumatic childhood, her years of humiliation and rejection, and her desperate need to prove her Catholic orthodoxy all contributed to the development of the fanaticism that characterized her. Persecution of Protestant believers. The political analysis of Mary's reign has demonstrated the impossibility of her religious objectives given the realities of 16th century English society. Mary's attempt to restore Catholic England was doomed to failure not because of any inherent superiority of Protestant ideas, but because of the practical and political obstacles to reversing a generation of religious change. Through systematic violence, the comparative analysis of religious persecution in 16th century Europe has shown that Mary's campaign was unusually systematic and brutal even by the standards of her time. While religious violence was common throughout Europe during this period, few rulers matched Mary's systematic approach to eliminating religious dissent through terror. The assessment of Mary's legacy must balance recognition of the historical context that shaped her actions with acknowledgement of the moral responsibility that comes with wielding absolute power. While Mary's persecution can be understood within the framework of 16th century religious conflict, It cannot be excused or justified by that context. The ultimate judgment of history on Mary's reign remains overwhelmingly negative, not because of Protestant propaganda, but because of the systematic nature of her cruelty and the complete failure of her policies to achieve their stated objectives. The Queen, who hoped to restore Catholic England through persecution, instead created lasting trauma that influenced English development for centuries. As we reach the end of our journey through Mary Tudor's reign of terror, we find ourselves contemplating the strange contradictions of a woman who began life as a beloved princess and ended it as one of history's most feared tyrants. The transformation from Mary, the child, playing music for foreign diplomats, to Mary the Queen, ordering the burning of pregnant women, represents one of the most dramatic character changes in all of English history. The woman who died on November 17, 1558, had achieved the opposite of everything she had hoped to accomplish. She had wanted to restore Catholic England, but had instead strengthened Protestant resolve. She had sought to heal the religious wounds created by her father's break with Rome, but had instead inflicted new trauma that would last for generations. She had dreamed of being remembered as a pious restorer, but would forever be known as Bloody Mary, the Queen who burned her people. The fires of Smithfield that had burned so brightly during Mary's reign were finally extinguished with her death, but their memory would burn forever in English consciousness. The smoke that had darkened London's skies for 5 years had dissipated, but the shadow of Mary's persecution would fall across English history for centuries to come. In the end, Mary Tudor's reign serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of religious extremism and the corruption that comes with absolute power. The woman who claimed to serve God through persecution had instead served only her own psychological needs and political ambitions. The Queen, who burned nearly 300 innocent people in the name of faith, had demonstrated only the depths of human cruelty when ideology overcomes compassion. The legacy of Bloody Mary extends far beyond the specific victims of her persecution to encompass broader questions about the nature of political authority, religious freedom, and human dignity. Her reign stands as a permanent warning about what happens when rulers claim divine sanction for systematic cruelty, and when fear becomes the primary tool of governance. As we close our exploration of this dark chapter in English history, we can find some comfort in knowing that Mary's reign of terror was brief and that her death brought immediate relief to a traumatized nation. The Queen who burned her people was gone, and England was finally free to begin the long process of healing from the wounds she had inflicted. The story of Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary, the Queen who burned her people, ends not with her death, but with the eternal warning her reign provides about the dangers of extremism and the corruption of power. Her 5-year reign of terror claimed nearly 300 lives and traumatized an entire generation. But perhaps its greatest legacy lies in the lessons it teaches about the importance of tolerance, moderation, and human dignity in political life. Mary's transformation from persecuted princess to persecuting queen demonstrates how trauma and extremism can corrupt even those who begin with legitimate grievances and sincere convictions. The woman who had suffered religious persecution herself became its most ruthless perpetrator, showing how victims can become victimizers when they gain access to absolute power. The systematic nature of Mary's persecution reveals how bureaucratic efficiency can be turned to evil purposes when moral restraints are abandoned. The machinery of death that Mary created operated with mechanical precision, demonstrating how administrative competence, without ethical guidance, can produce unimaginable horrors. The international dimension of Mary's persecution shows how religious and political extremism can damage not only domestic society, but also international relationships and global stability. Mary's reign isolated England from Protestant Europe and damaged Catholic credibility throughout the continent, demonstrating how extremism ultimately serves no one's interests. The ultimate failure of Mary's persecution to achieve its stated objectives provides a powerful lesson about the ineffectiveness of terror as a tool of political and religious change. Despite 5 years of unprecedented violence, Mary's campaign strengthened rather than weakened Protestant resistance and created lasting opposition to religious extremism. Perhaps most importantly, the memory of Mary's persecution has served as a permanent reminder of the importance of religious freedom and tolerance in civilized society. The Protestant martyrs who died in Mary's fires became symbols of the human spirit's resistance to tyranny and the ultimate triumph of conscience over coercion. As you drift off to sleep tonight, dear listener, remember the lessons of Bloody Mary's reign. Remember that extremism in any form poses dangers to human dignity and social stability. Remember that power without moral restraint inevitably leads to corruption and cruelty. And remember that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance against those who would use fear and violence to impose their will upon others. Sleep peacefully now, knowing that the fires of Smithfield have been extinguished for over 4 centuries. But never forget the warning they provide about the darkness that can emerge when religious conviction becomes separated from human compassion. The queen who burned her people is long dead, but her legacy lives on as an eternal reminder of the importance of tolerance, moderation, and respect for human dignity in our political and religious life. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and may the memory of Mary's victims serve as guardian angels, protecting us all from the extremism that destroyed so many innocent lives during her reign of terror. The story of Bloody Mary is ended, but its lessons must never be forgotten.